Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. The greatest empire the world has ever seen did not fall in a single day, or a single battle, or even a single century. It fell the way most great things fall, slowly, then all at once, through 1,000 small failures that nobody noticed until it was far too late. Tonight we trace the complete story of Rome, from a cluster of mud huts on 7 hills above a muddy river, through centuries of republic and empire, through plague and civil war and barbarian kings, all the way to the quiet afternoon in 476 when a boy emperor handed over his crown and nobody particularly cared. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Before Rome was Rome, hills, shepherds, and a wolf. The Italian peninsula in the 8th century before the Common Era was not a place that announced its destiny. Looking at it from above, you would see a long boot of land kicking out into the Mediterranean, its spine formed by the Apennine Mountains running from north to south, its western coast lined with rolling hills and river valleys, its soil dark and generous, watered by seasonal rains that turned the landscape green and gold in alternating seasons. You would not look at it and think, there it is, the birthplace of the most consequential civilization the Western world has ever produced. It looked like a pleasant, moderately well-organized piece of geography inhabited by people who are mostly concerned with farming, raiding their neighbors, and arguing about water rights. Which, to be fair, is what most of human history looks like up close. The people who would eventually become Romans were called the Latins, and they lived in the region known as Latium, a coastal plain south of the Tiber River. They were not particularly remarkable among the various peoples who inhabited Italy at the time. To their north lived the Etruscans, a sophisticated and somewhat mysterious civilization who built proper cities, practiced elaborate religious rituals, and produced artwork of genuine quality. To their south were Greek colonies, planted along the Italian coastline and in Sicily, carrying with them the full weight of Hellenic culture, philosophy, and urban planning. The Latins sat between these two worlds, absorbing influences from both, belonging fully to neither. The site that would become Rome was, on its surface, not an obvious choice for greatness. 7 hills rose above the Tiber River at a point where the river could be forded, where an island in the middle of the current made crossing easier. The hills were defensible. The river provided both water and access to trade. The surrounding plain was farmable. These were the practical reasons a cluster of Latin villages began to coalesce in this particular spot, sometime around the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era. Nothing about the location said empire, it said, reasonably good place to keep sheep and not get raided too often. The Romans themselves told a different story about their origins, and it was a story that said quite a lot about who they believed themselves to be. According to the founding myth that every Roman schoolchild knew, the city was founded by Romulus in 753 BCE, give or take, following a chain of events that began at the fall of Troy. The Trojan hero Aeneas, so the story went, escaped the burning city carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand, sailed across the Mediterranean, landed in Italy, and founded a dynasty. Several generations later, a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia was visited by the god Mars and gave birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. The wicked king who had usurped their grandfather's throne ordered the twins drowned in the Tiber. Instead, the river carried them gently to shore, where a she-wolf found them and suckled them until a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys and raised them as his own. The twins grew up, overthrew the usurping king, and then decided to found a new city. They disagreed about which hill to build it on. They disagreed about who should be king, and in a founding moment that later Romans found slightly embarrassing to explain to visitors, Romulus killed Remus. The city was named after him. He ruled it. Rome was born now. The Romans knew this story was a myth, or at least the educated ones did. What they found important about it was not its literal truth, but its symbolic content. The story said that Rome was connected to Troy, to the heroic age, to divine parentage. It said that Rome's founder was the son of a war god. It said that Rome was built through determination so fierce that even fratricide could not stop it. It said, in other words, that Rome was special from the beginning, destined, chosen, the kind of civilization that gets suckled by wolves rather than ordinary mothers. Archaeology tells us something considerably more mundane. and in its own way more interesting. The hills above the Tiber were settled from at least the 10th century BCE, probably earlier. The earliest inhabitants left behind traces of huts, storage pits, and cemeteries, the unremarkable material culture of Iron Age farming communities. The Palatine Hill shows signs of continuous habitation. The Forum Valley below it was marshy ground used for burials before it was drained and transformed into the civic heart of the city. The transformation from scattered village clusters to something recognisable as an organised settlement seems to have occurred gradually through the 8th and 7th centuries, shaped in significant part by Etruscan influence from the north. The Etruscans, in fact, are crucial to early Rome and somewhat underappreciated in the traditional telling. They brought urban planning, monumental architecture, and religious practices that the Romans adopted and adapted. Etruscan kings may have ruled Rome for a significant period. The Latin word for a magistrate's bundle of rods, the fasces, is possibly Etruscan in origin. The practice of reading the entrails of sacrificed animals to divine the future, central to Roman religious life for centuries, came from Etruscan tradition. Rome did not spring fully formed from the head of Romulus. It was assembled, borrowed, adapted, and argued over across generations. But perhaps the most important thing that early Rome produced was not a building or a political system or a religious practice. It was an attitude. The Romans developed very early a peculiar and powerful relationship with their own past. They were intensely conservative in the original sense of that word. They believed that the customs of their ancestors, the mos maiorum, the way of the elders, contained wisdom that should never be lightly discarded. They looked backward for authority, cited precedent with the enthusiasm that later cultures would reserve for scripture, and framed even their most radical innovations as restorations of ancient practice. This conservative relationship with the past would shape Roman civilization from its earliest days through its final collapse, giving it extraordinary stability on one hand and extraordinary rigidity on the other. The village on the 7 hills had no idea what it was becoming. Shepherds tended their flocks on the Palatine. Farmers worked the black soil of Latium. The she-wolf, if she existed at all, went about her ordinary wolf business, entirely unaware that future generations would put her image on coins, on standards, and on the walls of public buildings across an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. It started, as most world historical things do, very quietly. The 7 Kings, Rome's first experiment in power. Rome, according to its own tradition, began as a kingdom. 7 kings ruled in succession from the founding in 753 BCE to the expulsion of the last king in 509 BCE, a period of roughly 244 years, during which the city grew from a collection of hill villages into something approaching a genuine urban centre, with walls, temples, civic institutions, and an increasingly restless population. The 7 kings are a fascinating mixture of the historical and the legendary, and untangling which parts are real from which parts were invented by later Romans to explain how things came to be is one of those delightful puzzles that historians find endlessly entertaining and everyone else finds mildly exhausting. So we will keep it manageable. Romulus, the first king, was the founder and a figure so thoroughly embedded in myth that treating him as a historical person in any conventional sense is difficult. According to tradition, he established the Senate as an advisory body of 100 elders, divided the population into 3 tribes, organised the first Roman army, and solved Rome's chronic shortage of women by inviting the neighbouring Sabines to a festival, and then having his men grab their women while everyone was distracted. This episode, known as the Rape of the Sabine Women, subsequently became a popular subject for sculptors, painters, and anyone who wanted to make a dramatic artistic statement about the tension between community building and basic hospitality. It ended eventually with the Sabines and Romans making peace and merging into a single people, which was either a heartwarming story of reconciliation or a reminder that the Romans were very good at turning awkward situations to their advantage. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was remembered as the great organizer of Roman religion. Where Romulus had been a warrior, Numa was a man of peace who established the priestly colleges, the calendar, and the rituals that would govern Roman religious life for centuries. He was said to receive his wisdom from the nymph Egeria, whom he met secretly in a sacred grove at night, which the Romans seemed to find entirely plausible, and which later Christian commentators found extremely suspicious. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was another warrior type who fought and absorbed the neighbouring Latin city of Alba Longa. The fourth, Ancus Marcius, was remembered as a builder who constructed Rome's first bridge across the Tiber and established the port of Ostia at the river's mouth. These two kings tend to get less attention than the others, which is a bit unfair. Not every monarch can be either a mythological wolf brother or a religious innovator or, as we're about to see, a dramatically corrupt tyrant. Someone has to be responsible for the bridge. The 5th, 6th, and 7th kings were all Etruscans, which tells us something important. Rome in this period was not yet a fully independent Latin city. It was a place where Etruscan power was real and present. Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king, was a wealthy Etruscan immigrant who talked his way into Roman politics, became enormously popular, and eventually seized the throne. He built the Circus Maximus, began work on the great temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and expanded the Senate. His successor Servius Tullius was possibly even more important, reorganizing Roman society into classes based on wealth rather than birth, creating the census, and building the great defensive wall around the city that would bear his name. And then came the last king, Tarquinius Superbus. Superbus is Latin for proud, and it was not meant as a compliment. He was remembered as a tyrant who ruled through fear, ignored the Senate, and generally treated Rome as his personal property, rather than a community he was responsible for governing. He also began building projects of enormous ambition, including completing the great temple to Jupiter, which would become one of the most important religious sites in Rome. But no amount of impressive construction can save a ruler's reputation if his son does something bad enough, and Sextus Tarquinius did something very bad. The story goes that Sextus, the king's son, became obsessed with Lucretia, a Roman noblewoman of exceptional virtue who was married to one of his kinsmen. He visited her home while her husband was away, was received hospitably as family, and during the night crept to her room and raped her. Lucretia the next day summoned her father and husband, told them what had happened, and then killed herself with a dagger rather than live with the dishonour. She was, by Roman standards, doing the noble thing. Her kinsman Brutus, who had been pretending to be a fool in order to survive the dangerous court of the Tarquins, revealed his true intelligence, held up the bloody dagger before the people of Rome, and led the revolution that expelled the royal family forever. Now, how much of this is literally true is genuinely uncertain. The rape of Lucretia, the dramatic suicide, the revelation of Brutus's hidden brilliance. These have the shape of a founding myth more than a historical incident. But what is certainly true is that around 509 BCE, the Roman monarchy ended. The Tarquin family was expelled. Rome would never again have a king, and the Romans would spend the next 5 centuries being positively neurotic about the very word. If you wanted to accuse a Roman politician of the worst possible ambition, you called him a rex, a king. It was the ultimate insult. The republic that replaced the monarchy was, among other things, an institutionalized rejection of one-man rule built on the memory, real or invented, of a king's son's crime. The republic rises. 2 consuls and a senate full of old men. The Roman Republic is one of the most studied governmental experiments in human history, and it deserves that attention. Not because it was perfect, it was far from perfect, but because it represented a genuinely creative attempt to solve a problem that every complex society eventually faces. How do you organize power in a way that prevents any single person from accumulating too much of it, while still allowing decisions to be made and wars to be won and roads to be built? The Romans' answer was essentially to make everything complicated on purpose. At the top of the republican system sat 2 consuls, elected annually, each of whom had the power to veto the other. One consul could cancel any decision the other made simply by saying no. This was a feature, not a bug. The Romans designed it that way deliberately, because they had just spent several generations under kings, and they were not going to let that happen again. The consuls held what was called imperium, the power to command, but it was limited in time, checked by a colleague, and constrained by an elaborate web of other institutions. The Senate was the great deliberative body of the Republic. It didn't pass laws in the way modern legislatures do. It issued opinions, debated policy, and controlled the state finances, and because it was composed of former magistrates who served for life, it embodied the accumulated experience and conservative wisdom of Rome's most prominent families. The Senate was slow, deliberate, and deeply suspicious of novelty. These were, again, features rather than bugs, given what had just happened with the Tarquins. Below the consuls and parallel to the Senate was a growing array of other magistrates. Praetors handled legal matters and military command when consuls were unavailable. Censors, elected every 5 years, conducted the census, managed public morality, and controlled the contracts for public building. Quaestors handled finances, aediles maintained public buildings, organised games, and regulated markets. Each office had specific powers and limitations. Each was held for a fixed term. None could be held for life except the censorship of public morality, which was honorary and largely symbolic. There was also a provision for genuine emergency. In a crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single man with supreme authority over both civil and military affairs, but the dictatorship was strictly limited to 6 months, and any dictator who exceeded that term or attempted to hold the office beyond the crisis would face the full weight of Roman disapproval, which is a polite way of saying they would probably be assassinated. This is the system as it was designed. The reality, as always, was somewhat messier. The fundamental tension within the early Republic was not between good government and bad government. It was between two groups of Romans who wanted very different things. The patricians were the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the original Senate of Romulus, and who, in the early Republic, monopolized almost all political offices and religious priesthoods. The plebeians were everyone else, from wealthy merchants and landowners to small farmers, to the genuinely poor united primarily by their exclusion from the most important positions in Roman public life. The struggle between these two groups, which historians call the conflict of the orders, lasted for roughly 2 centuries, from the early 5th century to the late 3rd century BCE. It was conducted through political maneuver, strikes, emigrations, legal challenges, and occasional violence, and it resulted in one of the most significant expansions of political rights in the ancient world. The plebeians' most powerful weapon was the withdrawal of their labour and military service. In a city that depended on plebeian soldiers to fight its wars, the patricians could not simply ignore demands for fairer treatment. The first great victory came with the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, magistrates elected by and from the plebeian assembly, who held an extraordinary power. The power of sacrosanctity, meaning their persons were legally inviolable, and the power to veto any action by any Roman magistrate, including the consuls. The tribune's veto, the intercessio, was the plebeians' nuclear option, and they were not shy about using it. Over the following centuries, the plebeians won the right to have Roman law written down and publicly displayed, ending the situation where patrician priests and judges could interpret the law however suited their class interests. The famous 12 tables, inscribed around 450 BCE and displayed in the Forum for all to read, were the result of this campaign. They were a basic legal code covering property, family, inheritance, and procedures, not particularly radical in content, but revolutionary in form because they were available to everyone. The plebeians eventually won access to the consulship, to the priesthoods, to every major office of state. By the late Republic, the distinction between patrician and plebeian had faded significantly, replaced by a new aristocracy that mixed old family names with new money and military glory. The old battles had been won. The system had, in its creaking, complicated way, adapted and expanded. What the system had not solved, and what would eventually destroy it, was the question of what happened when the rules themselves became weapons in the hands of those with enough power to ignore them. But that problem was still several centuries away. For now, the Republic worked. Not perfectly, not always fairly, but well enough to take a cluster of Latin villages and turn them into the masters of Italy, and then into something considerably more than that. Rome versus everyone. The early wars and the making of a military machine. The Roman Republic did not achieve dominance over the Italian peninsula because it was the most culturally sophisticated civilization in the region. It was not. The Etruscans had better art. The Greek colonies of southern Italy had better philosophy and urban planning. The Samnites had warriors every bit as fierce as Rome's. Rome achieved dominance for a more specific reason. It was extraordinarily, almost pathologically good at war, and it got better at war every time it lost one. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the early Roman military mind. Romans did not experience defeat as Romans of later centuries, or as many modern cultures experienced failure. They experienced it as a problem to be solved. Every military setback prompted immediate analysis, institutional adaptation, and renewed effort. The Roman army in 500 BCE was a competent but not exceptional force. The Roman army in 200 BCE was something that no opponent in the Western world could reliably defeat in open battle. That transformation happened through 2.5 centuries of essentially continuous warfare that functioned, unintentionally, as the world's most expensive military training program. The early Republic fought its first major wars against its closest neighbours, the other Latin peoples of Latium. These were the Latin wars, and they were, by later Roman standards, small-scale affairs, fights over agricultural land, grazing rights, and the control of important road junctions. Rome won more than it lost, absorbed some defeated communities as citizens, made others into allies bound by treaty, and gradually extended its influence across the Latin plain. The Romans were already practicing the policy that would define their expansion for centuries. They rarely exterminated defeated enemies if they could avoid it. They preferred to incorporate them, turn them into Romans, or at least into allies who contributed soldiers to Rome's armies, and then use those expanded forces to fight the next enemy. This was not altruism. It was systematic strategic genius. The great test of the early Republic came from the north in 390 BCE, when a mass of Gallic tribes crossed the Apennines and descended into northern and central Italy. The Romans encountered the Gauls at the Allia River just north of Rome. What happened next was, by any standard, a catastrophe. The Roman army was routed, fled in disorder, and abandoned the city itself. The Gauls marched into Rome, burned most of it, and settled in to besiege the Capitoline Hill, where a remnant of the Roman Senate and their guards had taken refuge. The story of how Rome was saved at this point became one of the great foundation legends of the Republic. According to tradition, the Gauls attempted a night assault on the Capitoline, climbing the cliffs in darkness. They were almost undetected until the sacred geese of Juno, kept in the temple at the summit, began to honk and wake the defenders. Rome was saved by geese. The Romans did not find this embarrassing. They found it proof of divine favour. They kept sacred geese on the Capitoline for centuries afterward, fed at public expense, in honour of the birds that had saved the city. This is the kind of institutional memory that Romans were very, very good at. The Romans eventually paid a ransom to the Gauls, who departed. Rome spent the next generation rebuilding, constructing new walls, reorganising its army, and resolving never to be caught so badly unprepared again. The lesson of the Gallic sack was absorbed and institutionalised. The wars against the Samnites were perhaps more consequential for Rome's military development than any other conflict of the early Republic. The Samnites were a tough, mountain-dwelling people of the central Italian Apennines, who fought a series of 3 wars against Rome between 343 and 290 BCE. The first war was almost accidental and ended inconclusively. The second was nearly catastrophic. In 321 BCE, a Roman army of roughly 40,000 men was trapped in a mountain pass called the Caudine Forks and forced to surrender. The entire force was sent under the yoke, a ritualized humiliation in which soldiers passed beneath a framework of spears and released without battle. The Romans did not consider this acceptable. They fought the Samnites again, and eventually won. But the process transformed their army. The old Roman army had been organised in the Etruscan manner, a solid phalanx formation where men fought shoulder to shoulder with long spears. It worked well on flat ground. It worked very poorly in the mountains and hills of Samnium, where terrain was uneven and the phalanx could not maintain its formation. The Romans reorganised their infantry into smaller, more flexible units called maniples, arranged in 3 lines by experience and equipment. The front line carried throwing spears called pila and short stabbing swords called the gladius. The second and third lines provided support and backup. The whole formation could adapt to uneven ground, respond to flanking attacks, and maintain cohesion in conditions that would have broken the old phalanx into chaos. This new army would face its most famous early test not against the Samnites, but against a Greek king who had been invited to help the southern Italian Greek cities against Rome's growing power. Pyrrhus of Epirus arrived in Italy in 280 BCE with a professional army, war elephants, and a justified reputation as one of the finest generals of his age. He defeated the Romans twice. Both times he won the field but suffered losses his smaller army could not sustain. After the second victory, Pyrrhus is supposed to have said something that has been repeated ever since. Another such victory, he remarked, and I am undone, a Pyrrhic victory we still call it, a win that costs more than you can afford. Pyrrhus eventually gave up on Italy and went home. Rome continued to expand southward, absorbing the Greek cities, until by 270 BCE the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po Valley was under Roman control or alliance. The Romans had not merely conquered Italy, they had built a system of alliances, colonies, and citizenship grants that gave Rome access to the military manpower of the entire peninsula, a human reservoir that would allow them to absorb losses that would have destroyed any other power of the ancient world. The machine was ready. It just needed a properly worthy challenge. And across a narrow stretch of sea to the southwest, the city of Carthage was watching Rome's growth with considerable anxiety. Carthage must be destroyed. The Punic Wars. If you had asked an informed observer in 270 BCE which Mediterranean power would dominate the next century, most of them would not have said Rome. They would have said Carthage. Founded by Phoenician settlers on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Tunisia, Carthage was the greatest maritime and commercial power of the Western Mediterranean. Its trading networks stretched from West Africa to Spain. Its navy was the finest in the world. Its treasury was deep, its military tradition sophisticated, and its political institutions mature. It controlled Sardinia, western Sicily, and significant portions of the Iberian Peninsula. By any objective measure, Carthage was more powerful than Rome. Rome was, at this point in history, a regional Italian power that had never fought a war at sea. The idea that Rome would destroy Carthage within a century and a quarter would have seemed, to most observers, genuinely absurd. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE over a dispute about Sicily that neither side had particularly planned or wanted. It lasted 23 years, which tells you something about the stubbornness of both parties. It was in many respects the most transformative of the three Punic Wars for Rome, because it required Rome to do something it had never done before. Build a navy. Rome had no naval tradition whatsoever. The sea was not part of its military heritage, its cultural identity, or its collective imagination. And yet, facing a Carthaginian fleet that dominated the Mediterranean with generations of experience behind it, Rome did what Rome always did when confronted with an impossible problem. It found a solution and implemented it at a scale that was frankly astonishing. Working from a captured Carthaginian warship used as a template, Roman craftsmen built more than 100 warships in roughly 60 days. They trained the crews while the ships were still being built, using rowing benches set up on dry land. And then they added something nobody had ever seen before, a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge on a rotating pole at the bow of each Roman ship. When a Roman vessel came alongside an enemy, the corvus dropped and spiked into the enemy deck, locking the two ships together. Roman soldiers poured across and turned a naval battle into a land engagement. It was a brilliant, cheating, absolutely Roman solution to the problem of fighting a naval superpower when you're not actually a naval people. The First Punic War ended in 241 BCE with a Roman victory, Carthage ceding Sicily and paying a massive indemnity. The peace lasted 23 years. Then came Hannibal Barca, and everything got considerably more dramatic. Hannibal is one of the most extraordinary military commanders in human history. The son of a Carthaginian general who had fought Rome in the First War, he grew up in the Carthaginian Empire in Spain, reportedly having sworn as a small boy, at his father's request, eternal enmity to Rome. His opening move in 218 BCE was the most audacious in ancient military history. He marched an army from Spain across southern France, through the Alpine passes, and descended into northern Italy, with war elephants, in November. Across mountain passes that modern mountaineers with proper equipment find extremely challenging. He lost perhaps a third of his army crossing the Alps and most of his elephants, but he arrived in Italy still capable of fighting, and he immediately began winning with a ferocity that stunned the Roman world. At the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and finally at the Battle of Cannae in August of 216 BCE, Hannibal inflicted on Rome the worst battlefield defeats in its history, culminating in the systematic encirclement and destruction of a Roman army that may have outnumbered his own by 2-1. Between 40 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died at Cannae in a single afternoon. Rome lost more men that day than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. Hannibal waited in his camp for the Roman delegation to come and surrender. It never came. The Romans raised new armies, adopted a strategy of harassment and attrition under the general Fabius Maximus, and refused to break. Their Italian alliance system held, and eventually a young Roman general named Scipio proposed taking the war to Africa itself, forcing Hannibal home to defend Carthage on its own soil. The Senate was reluctant. Scipio went anyway, won in Africa, and defeated Hannibal in a straight fight at Zama in 202 BCE. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage stripped, humiliated, and alive. That last condition was corrected 50 years later, driven largely by the senator Cato, who ended every speech he ever gave, on any subject whatsoever, with the same 4 words. Carthage must be destroyed. Grain prices, aqueduct maintenance, bridge repair. Always, at the end, Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War ended in 146 BCE with Carthage razed to the ground, its population enslaved, and its site ploughed under. Rome now owned the Western Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean was already next on the list. Masters of the Mediterranean, conquest, culture, and Greek influence. There is a paradox at the heart of Rome's conquest of the Greek East, and the Romans were aware of it even as it was happening. They were militarily dominant. They won every major battle. They imposed their will on the Hellenistic kingdoms that had grown from the fragments of Alexander the Great's empire. But culturally, intellectually, artistically, they felt, and were, inferior to the world they were conquering. The poet Horace, writing in the 1st century BCE, captured this precisely. Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit, he wrote. Captive Greece took captive her wild conqueror. The image was of Rome as the savage barbarian who had broken down the door of the most sophisticated civilization in the world, and then, slowly, been civilized by it. Rome's engagement with the Greek East began in earnest in the early 2nd century BCE. The Hellenistic kingdoms, the successors of Alexander's empire, were already weakened by generations of warfare among themselves. Macedon, which had briefly united Greece under Philip II and then conquered the Persian Empire under his son Alexander, was still a significant power, but no longer dominant. The kingdoms of the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt were older and richer but internally divided. Into this world stepped Rome, initially in response to specific requests for help, eventually simply because expanding power has its own logic and appetite. The Macedonian Wars ended with Roman dominance over Greece and Macedon by 148 BCE. The kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor was bequeathed to Rome by its last king, who apparently calculated that Roman protection was worth more than continued independence. Roman power in the Eastern Mediterranean became, within 2 generations, essentially unchallengeable, and the Romans started bringing home the loot. The Greek world was full of things Rome did not have. Statues of bronze and marble, by artists whose names were famous across the Mediterranean. Libraries of scrolls containing centuries of accumulated philosophy, science, history, medicine, and poetry. Architects who could build in styles that made Roman building of the same period look crude by comparison. Rhetoricians who could make a speech sound like music. Philosophers who had spent centuries thinking seriously about questions of ethics, politics, and the nature of reality. All of this began moving west, sometimes voluntarily, as Greek intellectuals found eager Roman patrons, sometimes involuntarily, as conquerors packed up artwork and carried it home. The wealthy Roman generals who returned from Eastern campaigns brought Greek sculpture to decorate their villas, brought Greek tutors to educate their children, brought Greek cooks to prepare their meals, brought Greek philosophical texts to read in their leisure hours. Rome absorbed Greek culture the way a sponge absorbs water, deeply and completely, until it was difficult to know where one ended and the other began. The Latin language was transformed by Greek contact. Greek words flooded in, covering concepts for which Latin had no precise equivalent. Philosophy, astronomy, rhetoric, medicine, theatre, poetry in the Greek forms, all of these became Roman obsessions. The children of Rome's elite were educated in both Latin and Greek, often by Greek tutors who were technically slaves. Latin literature self-consciously modelled itself on Greek originals. Roman religious practice absorbed Greek deities wholesale, identifying Roman gods with their Greek counterparts. Jupiter became Zeus, Juno became Hera, Mars became Ares. The old Roman gods put on Greek masks and kept their Roman names. This cultural fusion was not passive acceptance. Romans were selective, argumentative, and competitive about their borrowings from Greece. They took what they valued, modified it to fit Roman contexts, argued fiercely about what was worth keeping, and generally transformed their Greek sources into something distinctively Roman. Roman architecture borrowed Greek columns, and then used concrete to build on a scale that Greek architecture had never attempted. Roman rhetoric took Greek models and created a Latin oratorical tradition that culminated in Cicero, who was arguably the greatest prose stylist in the ancient world. Roman philosophy took Stoicism, the Greek philosophical school founded by Zeno of Cyprus, and made it the moral backbone of the Roman ruling class. The changes in daily life were equally profound. Wealth from Eastern conquest made Rome, for the first time, a truly cosmopolitan city. the Forum filled with new temples and monuments. Private houses, at least among the wealthy, expanded and grew more elaborate. Dining became a social art form, with elaborate meals served on fine pottery, accompanied by entertainment, discussion, and quantities of wine that would make most modern people extremely ill. The Roman aristocracy developed the habit of retreating to country villas for the summer, a practice borrowed from the Greek cities of southern Italy and Sicily, where comfortable country estates had long been the mark of a prosperous family. But the wealth was not distributed evenly. It never is. And the Roman peasantry, who had provided the manpower for all these military victories, were about to discover that the rewards of empire went mainly to those who already had plenty. The Republic cracks. Slaves, land, and the Gracchi brothers' success, it turns out, can be just as dangerous to a society as failure, sometimes more so, because success conceals the fractures that failure would make obvious. Rome in the 2nd century BCE was the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. It was also a society in the process of breaking itself from the inside, slowly, through structural changes that its governing class was largely unwilling to acknowledge and entirely unprepared to address. The problem began with land, or rather it began with the combination of land, slaves, and war. When Roman soldiers went off to fight Rome's wars, they could be away for years. During that time, their small farms, the economic foundation of the Roman middle class, often could not be maintained by the families left behind. Wives and children worked as hard as they could, but farms without their primary labour force slipped into debt, then into crisis, then into foreclosure. Meanwhile, the wealthy families of the Senate were buying up land with the profits of conquest, creating enormous agricultural estates worked by slaves captured in the same wars that were destroying the small farmers. The small farmers who returned from fighting found their old farms gone, absorbed into the great latifundia that were spreading across Italy. Without land, they could not serve in the army, which required soldiers to own property. They drifted to Rome and other cities, swelling the urban poor, the proletariat who owned nothing but their children. The slaves who worked the new estates came in floods from the conquered territories, hundreds of thousands of human beings captured in war or purchased from dealers, working in conditions of extraordinary brutality in the mines of Spain, the farms of Sicily, the estates of Campania. The slave population of Italy by the late 2nd century BCE was enormous, perhaps a third or more of the total population, and keeping that many enslaved people in submission required a particular kind of social violence, a normalization of cruelty that infected the broader culture. The slave revolts that erupted in this period were a direct consequence of these conditions. The Sicilian slave revolts of 135 and 104 BCE involved tens of thousands of enslaved people and required significant Roman military effort to suppress. The most famous slave revolt of all, the rebellion of Spartacus from 73 to 71 BCE, would come later, but its roots lay in exactly this period of agricultural transformation and massive enslavement. Into this situation stepped two brothers who are among the most sympathetic and most doomed figures in Roman history. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were the grandsons of Scipio Africanus, the hero of Zama. They came from the highest level of Roman aristocracy. They had every advantage that Roman society could provide, and they chose to use those advantages to argue for reform. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE. He proposed a law enforcing an old and mostly ignored limit on the amount of public land, the ager publicus, that any individual could hold. The public land that wealthy families had occupied for generations would be redistributed to landless citizens. The proposal was legally sound, historically precedented, and politically explosive. It threatened the property interests of the senatorial class directly and specifically. What happened next was a preview of the future. The Senate arranged for another tribune, Tiberius's colleague Marcus Octavius, to veto the land bill. Tiberius did something unprecedented and constitutionally questionable. He had Octavius removed from office by popular vote. He got his land bill passed, and then, as his year in office was ending and he sought a second tribunate, which was also unprecedented and viewed with deep suspicion, a mob of senators and their supporters beat him to death in the Forum with chairs, clubs, and anything else that came to hand. The murder of Tiberius Gracchus was Rome's first major act of political violence in centuries. It established a precedent that the aristocracy would use repeatedly in the coming century. When political reform threatened economic interests, and when the traditional tools of obstruction were insufficient, violence was available. The Republic had crossed a line from which it could not uncross. Tiberius's younger brother Gaius took up the cause 10 years later with broader ambitions and greater political skill. Where Tiberius had focused narrowly on land reform, Gaius built a wider coalition, adding urban grain subsidies, infrastructure spending, and an attempt to extend Roman citizenship to the Italian allies. He was enormously popular with the common people of Rome and an enormously capable politician. He served 2 consecutive terms as tribune, another innovation. The Senate and its allies destroyed him through a combination of outbidding him on popular measures, dividing his coalition, and eventual violence. In 121 BCE, confrontation between Gaius's supporters and the Senate's forces led to a massacre. Gaius, seeing the situation was lost, had himself killed by a slave rather than be captured. His head was reportedly brought to the consul who had offered to pay its weight in gold, and the consul's allies allegedly filled the skull with lead to increase its weight before handing it over. This is the kind of detail that either definitely happened or was invented to make the victors look as bad as possible. In Roman history, both options are always on the table. The Gracchi were gone. Their reforms were partially reversed. The land problem was not solved. The structural tensions in Roman society had not been resolved. They had been suppressed by violence, and suppressed tensions have a way of building until they find an outlet. Marius and Sulla. When Rome turned on itself, Gaius Marius was born around 157 BCE into an equestrian family from the town of Arpinum in Latium, not far from Rome. He was what the Romans called a new man, a homo novus, meaning the first of his family to reach the Senate, without the long aristocratic lineage that was supposed to be the prerequisite for political success. He had served in the army under Scipio Aemilianus at the destruction of Numantia, proved himself a capable soldier and officer, worked his way up through the political cursus honorum, and made an advantageous marriage to a woman from the Julian family, an old patrician clan which gave him connections above his original station. He was not, by any conventional measure, supposed to become the most important Roman of his generation. He was too new, too blunt, too openly dismissive of the aristocratic niceties that Roman political life required. He made enemies easily and did not much care. These are generally not qualities that lead to success in deeply traditional political systems. Marius became consul for the first time in 107 BCE, breaking with the normal pattern, and spent the next decade breaking with normal patterns so consistently that the Republic barely recognized itself by the time he was done. He was elected consul 7 times, a number so far outside normal practice that even Romans who admired him found it alarming. He reformed the Roman army in ways that transformed not just military effectiveness, but the political relationship between soldiers, commanders, and the state. The Marian reforms, as they are known, were partly driven by necessity. Rome faced serious military threats in the late 2nd century, a disastrous war in North Africa against the Numidian king Jugurtha, and a devastating incursion by Germanic tribes, the Cimbrian Teutons, who had destroyed Roman armies in Gaul and were threatening to invade Italy itself. The traditional property requirement for military service was restricting Rome's ability to raise sufficient troops. Marius simply abolished it. He opened the legions to volunteers regardless of property, arming and equipping them at state expense. This was practical and effective. Marius destroyed the Cimbrian Teutonese in 2 decisive battles, 49 BC and 102 BCE, saving Italy from invasion and earning himself a reputation as the 3rd founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus, who had rebuilt the city after the Gallic sack. He was enormously popular. He was also, without fully intending it, a man who had set in motion a change with consequences he could not control. When Rome equipped poor men as soldiers and promised them land grants on retirement, those soldiers became bonded to their commanders in a way that property-owning soldiers had never been. A soldier who owned a farm was fighting for Rome, for his family, for his own stake in the Republic's success. A soldier who owned nothing and came into the army with nothing and expected land from his general upon discharge was fighting for his general. The army's loyalty shifted subtly but irreversibly from the state to the individual commander who could deliver on the promise of a reward at the end of service. And generals who could command that kind of personal loyalty began to understand that the army could be used in ways that had previously been unthinkable. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was, in many ways, everything Marius was not. He was of impeccable patrician lineage. He was cultured, theatrical, and capable of extraordinary personal charm as well as extraordinary personal cruelty. He was a brilliant general who had served under Marius and who harboured ambitions that went beyond anything his superior had ever contemplated. He was also, when the time came, willing to do the one thing that remained genuinely shocking in Roman political culture. He marched his army on Rome. In 88 BCE, a political crisis over the command of the war against Mithridates of Pontus, which was expected to be enormously profitable, led to a standoff between Sulla, who had been assigned the command, and Marius, who wanted it and used his political allies to have the assignment transferred to himself. Sulla's response was to march his 6 legions south from their camp at Nola, enter Rome at the head of an army, drive Marius into exile, and seize control of the city by military force. The Senate, which was present, did not resist because there was nothing it could do to resist 6 legions. Rome had never experienced anything like this. In the entire history of the Republic, the distinction between armed military power and civilian political authority had been maintained with almost religious care. The Rubicon, the river north of Rome beyond which a general was forbidden by law to bring his army, existed precisely to enforce this distinction. Sulla had not technically crossed the Rubicon. He had done something worse. He had crossed every psychological and constitutional barrier that stood between military power and direct political control. Sulla reorganized the government to his satisfaction, passed laws strengthening the Senate and restricting the tribunate, then marched east to fight Mithridates. Marius came back from exile with an army of his own, retook Rome, and in an orgy of killing that shocked even contemporary Romans, murdered as many of Sulla's associates and supporters as he could find. He died in 86 BCE, only days into his unprecedented 7th consulship, possibly of pleurisy. Given the circumstances, this may have been a mercy. Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE. He fought his way back to Rome, declared himself dictator, and proceeded to conduct history's first formal political purge. He posted lists, prescription lists, naming individuals who were to be killed, their property confiscated, and their killers rewarded. The list could be, and were, expanded at will. Thousands died. Their properties enriched Sulla's supporters. The message was clear. Political opposition to a man who controlled the legions was not just unwise, it was fatal. And then Sulla did something even more astonishing. In 79 BCE, having reorganized the Roman government to his satisfaction, he resigned the dictatorship, retired to his country estate, and spent his last year writing his memoirs and, according to some sources, drinking heavily. He died in 78 BCE, natural causes. The precedent he left behind was more dangerous than any permanent tyranny would have been. He had shown that a successful general could march on Rome, take absolute power, do whatever he liked with his political enemies, and then walk away. The fact that he walked away did not reassure thoughtful Romans. It terrified them, because if one man could do it once, another man could do it again, and the next one might not choose to leave. The first triumvirate, Crassus, Pompey, and a young man named Caesar. The Roman political world of the early 1st century BCE was one where everyone with any significant power was looking for allies, because power alone was no longer enough. The events of the Marian and Sullan years had demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that the rules of the Republic were negotiable if you had enough soldiers, and that traditional political success through the Senate and magistracies was far more vulnerable than it appeared. What you needed in this environment was a coalition. 3 men formed one such coalition in 60 BCE, and while the Romans never gave it a formal name, historians call it the First Triumvirate. The 3 men were Marcus Licinius Crassus, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. They were, to put it simply, the richest man in Rome, the most famous general in Rome, and the most politically ambitious man in Rome. Together they controlled enough money, military reputation, and popular support to dominate Roman politics. Separately, they were vulnerable. Marcus Crassus had made his fortune during Sulla's proscriptions, buying the confiscated properties of the condemned at catastrophically reduced prices, and then, by various accounts, also buying burning buildings at similarly reduced prices on the understanding that his private fire brigade would arrive and put out the flames, assuming a satisfactory deal could be struck while the building continued to burn. He was, by the late Republic, almost certainly the wealthiest private individual in Roman history. He was also desperately hungry for military glory, which money could not buy and which the Roman aristocracy valued above almost everything else. He had suppressed the Spartacus slave revolt in 71 BCE, which had been militarily significant, but the real credit for ending the war had been grabbed by Pompey, who arrived at the end and crucified 6,000 of Spartacus's captured followers along the Appian Way. Crassus never forgot or forgave. Gnaeus Pompeius, called Magnus the Great, had earned his cognomen through a series of military campaigns of extraordinary success. He had cleared the Mediterranean of the pirates who were disrupting Roman trade, an operation that took roughly 3 months, and which Pompey organised with logistical brilliance that still impresses military historians. He had then been given command of the war against Mithridates of Pontus, and had not only defeated Mithridates, but extended Roman power throughout the entire eastern Mediterranean, reorganising kingdoms, creating new provinces, and returning to Rome having fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. He was the most celebrated general in the Roman world. He was also politically naive in ways that would eventually destroy him. Gaius Julius Caesar was, in 60 BCE, a man of moderate accomplishments relative to his ambitions. He was from an ancient patrician family, the Julians, who claimed descent from the goddess Venus through Aeneas, which is exactly the kind of ancestry claim that becomes either a punchline or a political asset depending on how well things go for you later. He had served competently in Spain, had been a popular politician in Rome, had debts that were truly heroic in their scale, and had demonstrated a talent for charming both ordinary Romans and important patrons that bordered on supernatural. He was also, as everyone who dealt with him eventually understood, operating on an entirely different level of ambition from the people around him. The three men needed each other. Pompey needed political support to get his eastern settlement ratified, and his veterans their promised land grants, which the Senate was obstructing out of jealousy and spite. Crassus needed political cover for his financial interests and eventually a military command that might bring him the glory he craved. Caesar needed the money and military backing that would allow him to pursue the kind of command that would make him Pompey's equal. The triumvirate worked initially with considerable effectiveness. Caesar got himself elected consul for 59 BCE and steamrolled the Senate's opposition with a combination of popular assemblies and the implied threat of Pompey's veterans in the streets. Pompey got his eastern settlement ratified and his veterans their land. Crassus got financial legislation he needed. Caesar got a 5-year command in Gaul, which was the real prize, the thing that made the whole arrangement worthwhile for him. The triumvirate was cemented by a family connection. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia. Caesar married Calpurnia, from a family allied with Crassus's political network. The marriages were political instruments dressed in the language of family alliance, which is to say they were thoroughly Roman. The trouble came, as trouble always does, from ambition, accident, and the inherent instability of any arrangement that depends on 3 people continuing to trust each other indefinitely. Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter, died in 54 BCE. She had been a genuine bond between the 2 men, and those who knew both of them believed she was one of the few people who could manage both her husband and her father simultaneously. With her gone, the personal connection dissolved. Then in 53 BCE, Crassus finally got his military command, leading an army east to fight the Parthian Empire, which occupied the territory of modern Iraq and Iran. At Carrhae, in what is now southeastern Turkey, Crassus's army was annihilated by Parthian horse archers. The Roman legions, trained to fight at close quarters, found themselves unable to engage an enemy that simply rode out of range and shot arrows at them all day. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers died. 10,000 were captured. Crassus himself was killed, reportedly by having molten gold poured down his throat by Parthian captors who considered the gesture appropriate for a man whose love of wealth was legendary. The triumvirate was now a duumvirate, which is a much less stable arrangement. 2 powerful men with one enormous prize between them is not a partnership. It is a countdown. Caesar, the man who changed everything. Julius Caesar spent 9 years in Gaul, and he wrote about those 9 years himself in one of the most readable pieces of military history ever composed, the Commentariae de Bello Gallico, the Commentaries on the Gallic War. He wrote it in the third person throughout, which was either a literary convention of the age or the single most confident act of self-promotion in ancient history, or quite possibly both. He refers to himself as Caesar, never as I, which has the slightly disorienting effect of making the reader feel they are watching a god narrate his own activities from a polite and respectful distance. The Gallic Wars were, by any honest measure, extraordinary. Caesar conquered an area roughly the size of modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland combined. He fought dozens of major engagements, bridged the Rhine twice to make a point to the Germanic tribes on the other side, and invaded Britain on 2 separate occasions, both of which were essentially expensive demonstrations of capability rather than genuine conquest. He was innovative, adaptable, and brutal when he calculated that brutality served his purposes, which was more often than his admirers tend to acknowledge. One ancient source estimated 1 million dead and 1 million enslaved across the Gallic campaigns. Modern historians consider the numbers exaggerated but directionally honest. The Gallic wars were not a pleasant affair dressed up in elegant Latin prose. They also made Caesar spectacularly wealthy. Gaul was a rich land, and its spoils flowed to Caesar and his soldiers in gratifying quantities. He used the money to build political networks in Rome, fund projects bearing his name, eliminate the debts that had once made him dependent on Crassus, and ensure his soldiers' loyalty with the ferocious personal devotion that Marian army reform had made structurally possible. Caesar was not merely a general, he was a political system that walked around in a toga. The crisis that ended in civil war was structurally inevitable from the moment Crassus died at Caere. Caesar in Gaul with his legions, Pompey in Rome with his reputation and his allies, and a Senate increasingly terrified of what Caesar intended to do the moment his command expired. When that command ended in 49 BCE, his legal immunity ended with it. He would become a private citizen. Private citizens could be prosecuted. His enemies had been keeping a list. Negotiations produced nothing. The Senate passed the ultimate emergency decree. Caesar's tribunes were threatened and fled north to join him. On January 10th or 11th, 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River into Italy at the head of a single legion, the 13th. He quoted, or was later reported to have quoted, a line from the Greek playwright Menander, Alea iacta est, the die is cast. What followed was quick and decisive in the way that things are quick and decisive when one side is Julius Caesar. Pompey and the Senate fled Italy for Greece. Caesar swept through the peninsula in weeks, demonstrating mercy so calculated it functioned as propaganda. He secured Spain, defeated Pompey's forces at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BCE, and pursued his old ally and rival eastward. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach by Egyptian courtiers who assumed incorrectly that this would please Caesar. When Caesar arrived and was presented with the severed head of the man he had spent years fighting, he reportedly wept. Whether from grief or from the political inconvenience of being robbed of a living prisoner, ancient sources differ. Egypt then produced Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, whose relationship with Caesar was both political and personal and lasted until his death. Their son Caesarion survived long enough to become a political inconvenience for the next ruler of Rome. Caesar spent 3 more years finishing the war, returning to Rome to accept honours that accumulated to genuinely uncomfortable levels. Dictator for 10 years, then dictator in perpetuity. He reformed the calendar, extended citizenship, reorganized the Senate, and received the entire Senate while seated on a golden throne, which the Romans found appalling. His ally Antony publicly offered him a crown during a festival. Caesar declined it, or appeared to, but the offer had been made in public, and its meaning was clear to everyone watching. The conspirators numbered around 60. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, they stabbed him 23 times in the theatre of Pompey. He fell at the base of a statue of his old rival. The conspirators expected gratitude. They expected the Republic to breathe again. They got chaos instead. And waiting just off stage with cold eyes and Caesar's name was a 19-year-old student from Greece. The second triumvirate and the death of the Republic. The men who killed Julius Caesar made a fundamental error in their planning. They decided what they were against, but failed to decide what they were for. They were against Caesar. They were for the Republic. But the Republic they imagined restoring had not existed in any functioning sense for decades, and they had no plan for the power vacuum they created by removing its most dominant figure. They held a bloody knife and no strategy. Mark Antony, Caesar's senior surviving lieutenant and the current consul, moved quickly. He secured Caesar's papers and treasury, delivered a funeral oration that turned the crowd against the conspirators with a skill that Shakespeare captured perfectly in his play, and positioned himself as Caesar's political heir. The conspirators fled Rome within days, convinced by the popular reaction that they were not, in fact, being greeted as liberators. Then Caesar's will was read. It revealed something nobody outside Caesar's closest circle had known. His heir, the young man he intended to inherit his name, his legacy, and his political position, was his great-nephew Gaius Octavius, a 19-year-old student in Greece who had never fought a battle or held a political office. Antony was not pleased. He had expected to inherit Caesar's position as the most powerful man in Rome, and had not anticipated competition from a teenager. The teenager arrived in Rome, announced that he was accepting his inheritance, and from that day forward was known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, which we will shorten to Octavian. He was, by immediate appearances, an absurd threat. He was young, slight, frequently ill, and entirely lacking in military experience or public reputation. He also had Caesar's name, Caesar's money, the loyalty of Caesar's veterans who received generous cash payments promised in the will, and a political intelligence that made everyone who underestimated him regret it. The period between 44 and 42 BCE was a time of extraordinary complexity. Multiple factions maneuvered for power. Cicero, the great orator and one of the Republic's most prominent statesmen, backed Octavian against Antony, considering the young man a useful tool who could be managed and discarded. In a series of speeches called the Philippics that remain among the most devastating political rhetoric ever written, Cicero demolished Antony's reputation and character with surgical precision. This was, in retrospect, a significant miscalculation. Cicero was 62 years old and had seen a great deal of Roman history, but had apparently not quite absorbed what Sulla and Caesar had demonstrated about the relationship between rhetoric and military power. Antony, Octavian, and a third figure named Lepidus, who controlled significant military forces in Gaul and Spain, formed the second triumvirate in 43 BCE. Unlike the first triumvirate, which was a private arrangement, the second was a formal legal office with extraordinary powers. Its first act was the publication of proscription lists in the Sullan tradition. Thousands of names were posted. Thousands of people were killed. Cicero was among the first. His head and hands were displayed on the rostra in the forum from which he had delivered so many of his famous speeches. Antony's wife, Fulvia, was said to have pushed pins through his tongue. Rome was, at this point, well past subtlety. The triumvirs then turned on the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius had raised armies in the east. At the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BCE, fought in 2 engagements, they were decisively defeated. Brutus and Cassius both died by suicide, the accepted honourable ending for a defeated Roman commander. The Republic's last defenders were gone. What followed was a decade of increasingly open rivalry between Antony and Octavian. Lepidus was sidelined and eventually stripped of his provinces and sent to spend the rest of his life as a powerless priest. The world was divided between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east, and it was not large enough for both of them. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen who had also been close to Caesar, was the propaganda gift that Octavian exploited with maximum effectiveness. Antony did genuinely seem besotted with Cleopatra, or at the very least deeply dependent on the resources of the Egyptian kingdom she controlled. He lived in Alexandria in a style that his enemies described as wholly un-Roman, attending Greek theatrical performances, wearing Eastern dress, treating Cleopatra as an equal and Alexandria as a legitimate seat of power. He also made a series of political and military decisions, including distributing Roman territories to Cleopatra's children, that gave Octavian exactly the ammunition he needed. Octavian declared war not on Antony, which would have been civil war, but on Cleopatra, which was much more presentable. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece in 31 BCE. Antony's fleet and army were defeated. Both he and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Within a year, with Octavian's forces closing in, both were dead. Antony fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, the last ruler of an independent Egypt and the last great rival to the man who would remake the Roman world, died by her own hand in her monument, denying Octavian the pleasure of parading her through Rome in his triumph. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BCE, master of the entire Roman world. He was 34 years old. The Republic was over, though almost nobody was willing to say so yet, and Octavian, whose genius lay in never saying so either, was about to invent a whole new way of organising power. Augustus, the man who saved Rome by pretending not to rule it. The problem Octavian faced in 29 BCE was essentially aesthetic. The Republic was finished in practice. Its institutions had been broken and circumvented for decades. Its champions were dead. Its fundamental principle, that no single man should hold permanent, unchallengeable power, had been systematically dismantled by a generation of ambitious generals with loyal armies. Octavian had won. He was master of Rome, Italy, and every province from Spain to Syria. But he could not say that. He could not call himself a king. He could not call himself a dictator, which Caesar had done and which had contributed directly to Caesar's assassination. He needed to exercise absolute power while appearing to restore the Republic, because the senators and administrators who ran the empire's machinery would cooperate with a system they could pretend was traditional, but would not easily cooperate with an open monarchy. His solution was a masterpiece of political theatre. In 27 BCE, in a carefully staged performance before the Senate, he announced that the crisis was over, and he was returning all extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate, knowing better than to take this literally, begged him to remain in public life and voted him a new name, Augustus the Venerable One, a word with religious overtones rather than a title of command, elevating its bearer above ordinary humanity without quite declaring him divine. He kept the provinces containing most of the army. He received the powers of a tribune, renewed annually, giving him personal inviolability and the veto over any law. He was princeps, first citizen. He was imperator, which would eventually give us the word emperor. He was, in short, a monarch who carefully avoided calling himself one, served by a political class that carefully avoided pointing out what he was. The system is called the Principate. It was a fiction, and it worked because fictions that serve everyone's interests are remarkably durable. Augustus governed for 44 years. The Pax Romana began with his reign. He secured frontiers, reformed taxation, reorganized provinces, and transformed Rome from, as he himself claimed, a city of brick to a city of marble. The building program alone was staggering. He also passed legislation promoting marriage and penalizing adultery, while simultaneously exiling his own daughter Julia for immorality. The family values campaign and the exiled daughter were not a flattering combination. The great catastrophe of his reign was the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, where 3 Roman legions were ambushed and annihilated by Germanic tribes under a leader named Arminius, who had served in the Roman army and understood exactly how to destroy it. 20,000 soldiers died. Augustus reportedly beat his head against the palace wall shouting for Varus, the lost general, to give him back his legions. The Rhine became the permanent border. The 3 lost legion numbers were never reused. Augustus died in 14 CE at 75, asking, reportedly, whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well enough. He had found Rome in ruins and left it in marble. The trap he left for his successors was equally impressive. He had built a system that worked beautifully with the right person at its head, and catastrophically with the wrong one, finding the right person reliably, through the unpredictable mechanism of dynastic succession, was not something the system was designed to guarantee. The next several emperors would demonstrate exactly what that meant. The Julio-Claudians, 4 emperors, and an alarming amount of poison. The 4 emperors who followed Augustus are among the most written about rulers in human history, which is both deserved and slightly misleading. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero fascinate us for reasons that have as much to do with their ancient sources as with their actual significance. Tacitus wrote about them with dark, ironic brilliance that makes his accounts compulsively readable and not entirely trustworthy. Suetonius compiled gossip with the dedication of a tabloid journalist and considerably less commitment to verification. What we know about the Julio-Claudians is real, disturbing, and filtered through writers with axes to grind. With that caveat stated, let us proceed, because even allowing for exaggeration, this is a genuinely remarkable group of people. Tiberius was the most competent of the 4, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most joyless. An excellent general and capable administrator, he was also, by the time he became emperor at 55, deeply embittered by decades of being treated as Augustus's second choice. He understood perfectly that the system he was inheriting was a sophisticated theatrical illusion, requiring its occupant to perform constantly. Tiberius was not a performer. He retreated to the island of Capri in 27 CE and spent the last decade of his reign governing Rome by correspondence, while a prefect named Sejanus accumulated almost imperial power in his absence, eliminating rivals through treason accusations and apparently planning to marry into the family. Tiberius eventually destroyed him through a letter to the Senate that appeared to be praising Sejanus until near the very end the denunciation arrived. Senators who had been applauding moments before found themselves in an extremely awkward social situation. Tiberius died in 37 CE, assisted according to some sources by a suffocating pillow wielded by his heir. Most historians treat this as a good story rather than established fact. Caligula, whose nickname means little boots from the miniature soldier's outfit army camps had made for him as a small boy, was 24 when he became emperor and was enormously popular for roughly the first 6 months. Then something went wrong. Whether illness, mental breakdown, or simply the revelation of a character previously kept under pressure, Caligula became the emperor his enemies described. The stories, making his horse a consul, demanding worship as a living god, throwing spectators into the arena, have a quality of Baroque invention that suggests exaggeration. Some of them almost certainly are invented, but enough is corroborated across independent sources to confirm that his 4-year reign was genuinely dangerous for anyone near the centre of power. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in 41 CE. The conspirators had no plan for what came next. What came next was Claudius, which surprised everyone, including Claudius himself. His family had spent decades treating him as an embarrassment due to his limp, his stutter, and his occasional drooling. What he actually was, we now suspect, was a highly intelligent man with a physical disability who had used his exclusion from public life to become a genuine scholar. He was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace after Caligula's assassination, and the guard decided he was the safest available option. He governed competently for 13 years, conquered Britain in 43 CE, and was badly served by his wives, the last of whom, Agrippina the Younger, manoeuvred her son Nero onto the throne before Claudius died in 54 CE, very possibly from poisoned mushrooms. The suspicion was extremely widespread. Nero's early reign was praised. Then his capable advisors died or retired, supervision ended, and Nero became his own worst idea. He killed his mother, which took multiple attempts, including a rigged boat she survived by swimming. He persecuted Christians after Rome's Great Fire of 64 CE. He built the Domus Aurea, a palace so enormous it occupied the city's centre and featured a 30-metre golden statue of himself. He fled Rome when the provinces rebelled in 68 CE and died by suicide on the city's outskirts, reportedly murmuring that what an artist was dying in him. He was not wrong that he was an artist. He was simply wrong about which qualities kept emperors alive. The Flavians and the 5 good emperors, Rome at its peak. The year 68 CE was, from Rome's perspective, not great. Nero was dead, the dynasty was finished, and within a year 4 different men would hold the title of emperor as legions across the empire back to their commanders, in what Tacitus later described as the year that revealed the secret of empire, that an emperor could be made somewhere other than Rome. This was either a liberating insight or a terrifying one, depending on where you were standing. The year of the 4 emperors ended with Vespasian, commander of the Eastern legions, who was fighting the Jewish revolt in Judea when the throne became available. He was not glamorous. He was a middle-aged man of equestrian background known for plain speech, practical sense, and a deadpan humour that the historical record preserves in unusually good condition. When told that dying emperors traditionally ascended to godhood, he remarked that he supposed he must be becoming a god. When his son Titus teased him about taxing the public latrines of Rome, Vespasian held a coin under the young man's nose and asked whether it smelled. It did not. Pecunia non olet. Money has no smell. The phrase is still quoted, which tells you something about the durability of a good line. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty and built the Colosseum on the site of Nero's private artificial lake, which was itself a political statement of considerable elegance. Nero had seized public land for personal extravagance. Vespasian was giving it back as an entertainment venue for 50,000 people. His son Titus completed the building, opened it with 100 days of games, responded generously to the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE that buried Pompeii, and died after 2 years in office before anything could go seriously wrong, earning himself an excellent posthumous reputation. His brother Domitian then reigned from 81 to 96 CE, grew steadily more paranoid, had capable people killed on suspicion, and was assassinated by a conspiracy that included his own wife. The Flavians ended as Roman dynasties tended to end. What followed was something genuinely different. The 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, ruled from 96 to 180 CE, and represent the longest sustained period of capable, humane imperial governance in Rome's history. Gibbon called it the period when the human race was most happy and prosperous, which was a typically 18th century overstatement that nonetheless contained something real. The mechanism behind their success was adoptive succession. Rather than relying on biological heirs, 4 of the 5 emperors adopted capable successors from outside their immediate family. The system worked beautifully, and the reason it worked is slightly embarrassing. None of the first 4 emperors happened to have a biological son who survived to adulthood. The moment Marcus Aurelius inherited the system and had a living son named Commodus, the adoption principle immediately became irrelevant, because it is considerably easier to believe in meritocratic succession when you have no personal alternative. Trajan conquered Dacia and pushed to the Persian Gulf, reaching the empire's greatest territorial extent. Hadrian withdrew from those conquests, recognizing overextension, and spent his reign consolidating frontiers and building Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, one of the most remarkable private journals in human history, while spending most of his reign fighting Germanic tribes on the Danube frontier. He fought them successfully and then left the empire to Commodus, who renamed Rome after himself and was eventually strangled in his bath. Rome at its peak stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Mesopotamia, and was held together by roads, law, and aqueducts that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. It was also, as everyone was about to discover, considerably more fragile than it looked. Daily life in the empire bred baths and blood sports. Before we follow Rome toward its decline, let us stop for a moment and actually look at what life was like inside the empire at its height. It is easy, following emperors and generals, to forget that most of the 50 million people in the Roman Empire were doing none of those things. They were farming, trading, arguing, eating, raising children, and dying of things we can now cure with a week of antibiotics. Their lives had more in common with ours than the distance of 2,000 years might suggest. Rome itself at its height held somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, the largest city in the Western Mediterranean world. It was, by many accounts, not a particularly pleasant place to live unless you were wealthy. The contrast between its public grandeur and its private squalor was extraordinary. The Forum, the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus holding over 100,000 spectators for chariot races, the great bath complexes serving as social centres with libraries, gardens and lecture rooms alongside the actual bathing pools, all of this was genuinely impressive. Adjacent to these monuments, largely invisible in the idealizing reconstructions, were the insulae, the crowded apartment blocks where most Romans actually lived. Tall, shoddily built, no running water, minimal cooking facilities, and situated above streets where throwing waste from upper windows onto pedestrians below was common enough that Roman law had specific liability provisions covering it. The smell of ancient Rome is something no reconstruction can convey, but which would have been immediately overwhelming. 500,000 people, no modern sanitation, livestock, tanneries, fullers processing cloth with human urine, and streets that served functions best left unspecified. The great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, helped. It did not solve the fundamental problem of what a pre-modern city of 1 million people smells like. The baths were the genuine social equalizer. Entry was cheap or free, and the great imperial complexes offered not just washing but exercise, gossip, business, and the experience of being scraped clean with a curved metal tool called a strigil, which sounds worse than Romans apparently found it. The games at the Colosseum were brutal, and the Romans knew it. But gladiators were also professionals who trained extensively, fought within rules, and could become genuine celebrities. A popular gladiator could earn his freedom. Some had fan clubs. None of this changes what the games fundamentally were. It does complicate the simple image of mindless slaughter. Women could not vote or hold office, but could own property, conduct business, and exercise real influence in ways the formal legal position did not reflect. Livia and Agrippina the Younger wielded something very close to political power, without ever holding a title. Slavery, however, cast a shadow over everything. Perhaps 1/3 of Italy's population was enslaved. It was not marginal. It was the foundation the entire economy rested on, and its brutality did not diminish because some enslaved people held positions of responsibility. That Rome held all of this together, across 50 million people and 3 continents, for centuries, remains its most extraordinary practical achievement. The army that built and defended everything. The Roman legion was perhaps the most consequential military institution in Western history, not because it was invincible, it was not. Not because it was technologically superior in every engagement. The Romans were frequently beaten by cavalry-heavy Eastern opponents, and learned painful lessons from opponents who adapted to terrain better than they did. The Roman legion was consequential because it was a self-reproducing system for creating capable, cohesive military units at scale, and because it served functions far beyond pure combat that made it the essential instrument of Roman imperial governance. The classic Roman legion of the imperial period numbered roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men, organized into 10 cohorts of 6 centuries each. The first cohort was double strength, 500 men, and contained the most experienced soldiers. A cohort was the basic tactical unit. The century, commanded by a centurion, was the basic social and administrative unit, roughly 80 men who trained together, marched together, camped together, and in the field ate and slept together. The centurion deserves special attention because the centurion was the backbone of the legion in a way that the generals and tribunes were not. A centurion was a professional career soldier who had risen from the ranks, typically serving 20 or more years, who was responsible for the day-to-day training, discipline, welfare, and combat effectiveness of his century. He was paid considerably more than ordinary legionaries, was authorized to beat soldiers who failed to perform their duties with a vine stick that was his symbol of office, and was expected to know every man under his command by name and personal circumstance. The quality of the Roman legion as a fighting force depended more on the quality of its centurions than on the quality of its senior commanders. A general with bad centurions was a disaster. A general with good centurions could win battles even with mediocre strategic direction. Legionaries served for 25 years, receiving regular pay that by the time of the Principate included not just wages but a share of any campaign spoils and, on honourable discharge, a grant of land or a cash payment equivalent to several years' salary. This 25-year commitment, with its deferred reward at the end, was the mechanism by which the post-Marian army remained bound to its commanders in a way that the old property-owning citizen army had not been. A soldier who had served 20 years of a 25-year commitment and who expected land at the end of it was extremely invested in his general's ability to deliver that land, and quite motivated to ensure his general remained in a position to do so. The legions were supplemented by auxiliary units, non-citizen soldiers recruited from the provinces, who typically served for 25 years and received Roman citizenship on discharge. This was an extraordinary mechanism for both military recruitment and cultural integration. A young man from Gaul who joined an auxiliary cavalry unit, served his 25 years, received his citizenship, and retired to settle near his former base of service, had been transformed, at least in legal terms, from a provincial barbarian into a Roman citizen. His sons could enlist as legionaries, his grandsons might be officers. The engineering capabilities of the Roman military were in some ways more impressive than its combat effectiveness. A Roman legion on campaign built a fortified camp every single night, laid out to a standard plan with defensive ditch, rampart and palisade, regardless of whether it expected to be there for one night or an entire winter. These temporary camps were replaced by permanent forts when legions established long-term garrisons on the frontier, and the forts were built in the same standardized plan, large enough that their outlines can still be identified from aerial photography across northern England and along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The roads that connected the empire were primarily military infrastructure, built to allow legions to move quickly, maintain communication, and supply the frontier garrisons. The Roman road network of some 80,000 kilometres was an engineering achievement that was not matched in Europe until the 19th century. Built on properly excavated and drained foundations, surfaced with fitted stone, cambered to drain rainwater, and provided with milestones marking distances and direction, Roman roads were designed to be usable in all weathers and were. Many of them form the basis of modern European roads. The problem that the army eventually posed for the empire was one of those structural issues that is easy to identify in retrospect, and essentially impossible to address once the system is running. An army that was loyal to its commanders rather than to the state was a political force as well as a military one. In the early Principate this was managed just barely, by the enormous prestige of the emperor and by the careful rotation of commands that prevented any general from building too personal a bond with specific legions. As the Principate weakened and emperors came and went with increasing frequency, the army increasingly became the kingmaker, the institution that made emperors rather than the instrument that served them. The armies of the 3rd century would demonstrate exactly how completely this dynamic could invert the intended relationship between political authority and military power. The 3rd century crisis, when everything fell apart at once. If you want to understand how empires fall, the 3rd century CE is your case study. Between 235 and 284, Rome experienced what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of such compounded catastrophe that it is genuinely surprising the empire survived it at all. Military emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Plague swept through the provinces repeatedly. Economic systems that had functioned for centuries collapsed under the strain. Invaders pressed the frontiers from every direction simultaneously, and for a period of roughly 15 years, the Roman Empire ceased to exist as a single political entity and fragmented into 3 competing pieces. By some counts, 50 different men held or claimed the title of emperor during this period, of whom the vast majority died violently. The average reign lasted slightly over a year. The record for brevity appears to be held by Gordian I and Gordian II, a father and son who were simultaneously declared emperors in Africa in 238 CE and who lasted approximately 3 weeks before Gordian II was killed in battle and Gordian I hanged himself from grief. This is history being genuinely merciless. The crisis began with the assassination of the last Severan emperor, Alexander Severus, in 235 CE. His replacement, a giant Thracian soldier named Maximinus Thrax, was the first emperor who had risen entirely from the ranks without any senatorial or aristocratic background. He never even visited Rome during his reign. His elevation set the tone for what followed. Military success and the loyalty of the troops were all that mattered. Political tradition, senatorial approval, legal legitimacy, these were decorations rather than foundations. The sources of pressure were multiple, and crucially, simultaneous. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic confederacies were forming that were considerably more organized and dangerous than anything Rome had faced before. The Alemanni, the Franks, the Goths, these were not the uncoordinated tribal raiding parties of earlier centuries. They were increasingly coherent political entities with better weapons, better organization, and in some cases genuine experience of Roman military tactics gained through service as auxiliaries. They probed the frontiers constantly, and when they found weak points, they poured through. In the east, the old Parthian Empire had been replaced by the more aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire under Ardashir of Amenes, and then his son Shapur-Thamdid. The Sassanids considered themselves heirs to the old Achaemenid Persian Empire that Alexander had destroyed, and they were actively interested in recovering territory in Syria and Mesopotamia that they considered Persian by historical right. In 260 CE, Shapur defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, the first and only time a Roman emperor was taken prisoner in combat. Valerian apparently spent the rest of his life in Persian captivity. Shapur is recorded as having used him as a mounting block when getting onto his horse. Whether this is literally true or Persian propaganda is debated. What is not debated is that it was a catastrophic humiliation that shook Roman self-confidence to its foundations. The plague, now believed to be a form of measles or smallpox based on the symptom descriptions in ancient sources, moved through the empire in waves from the 260s onward. Cities lost significant portions of their populations. Agricultural labour was disrupted. Tax revenues fell as the taxable population shrank. The military lost trained soldiers faster than they could be replaced. The psychological impact of mass death on populations that had no understanding of disease transmission and could only interpret epidemic as divine punishment was severe. The economic consequences of the crisis were deeply damaging and in some respects permanent. To pay the armies that were the only thing standing between the empire and complete dissolution, emperors debased the silver coinage, reducing its actual silver content while maintaining its face value. The result was inflation of a severity the ancient world had rarely seen. Prices for basic goods rose dramatically. People stopped accepting currency they did not trust and reverted to barter. Long-distance trade, which had flourished under the Pax Romana because reliable currency made it possible, declined sharply. The empire's economy, which had been integrated and commercially active, fragmented into more locally focused subsistence patterns that were more resilient in the short term and far less productive in the long term. The fragmentation of the empire itself occurred in the 260s under the rule, or rather the attempted rule, of Gallienus. Unable to be everywhere that needed defending simultaneously, the western provinces under the general Postumus declared a breakaway Gallic empire in 260 CE with its own emperor, senate, and institutions. The eastern provinces rallied around the city of Palmyra in Syria and its remarkable Queen Zenobia, who ruled as regent for her son and whose military forces held Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. Gallienus thus controlled only the Italian heartland, the Balkans, and North Africa, while 2 independent empires operated on his flanks. The reunification came through a series of remarkable emperors in the 270s. collectively called the Illyrian emperors because most of them came from the province of Illyricum in the modern Western Balkans. Claudius II defeated the Goths so decisively in 269 that he earned the cognomen Gothicus. His successor Aurelian, in a series of campaigns of breathtaking energy, reconquered both the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire in just a few years, earning himself the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, which was both accurate and indicative of how bad things had gotten, that reunifying your own empire needed to be celebrated as a restoration. Aurelian also built Rome's new defensive walls, the Aurelian walls that still partially survive today, because the age when Rome did not need walls because no enemy could reach it was definitively over. The crisis was survived, but it left the empire fundamentally transformed. The easygoing Principate of Augustus, the theatrical monarchy disguised as a republic, was gone. What replaced it was more openly autocratic, more militarized, and more fragile: Diocletian and Constantine. Two emperors who tried to save it all. Diocletian came to power in 284 CE and spent the next 20 years doing something that no 3rd century emperor had managed. He survived. More than survived. He stabilized the empire, reformed its administration, expanded and reorganized its army, and restructured its entire governmental framework so thoroughly that the system he created would define the late empire for the next 2 centuries. He was from Dalmatia, of humble origin, and had risen through military service. He was tough, practical, methodical, and deeply superstitious in a traditional Roman religious way that would eventually lead him to one of the most systematic persecutions of Christians in Roman history. He was not a visionary or a philosopher. He was an administrator of genius, which was exactly what the crisis had proved the empire needed. His most radical innovation was the tetrarchy, the system of 4 rulers. He divided imperial authority into 4 parts: 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each responsible for a geographical section of the empire, and each designated to succeed an Augustus when the senior emperor retired or died. The system was designed to ensure that every frontier had an emperor nearby, and that the problem of succession, which had generated so much violence, was solved by advanced planning and a clear designated successor. It worked while Diocletian was alive and in control, because he was a forceful enough personality to keep the other 3 in line. It began falling apart almost immediately after he did something else unprecedented. He voluntarily resigned the purple in 305 CE. When he retired to his palace in Split in Dalmatia, which he had built to be enormous enough to accommodate his court in retirement, and which still forms the core of the modern Croatian city of Split, he said he had done enough. He spent his final years growing cabbages. When someone later urged him to return to power given the chaos that followed his resignation, he reportedly replied that if they could see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would never ask him to give them up. This is the most human thing any Roman emperor ever said, and it makes Diocletian immediately likable in a way that his persecution of Christians somewhat complicates. The persecution was serious. Between 303 and 311 CE, Diocletian and his successors conducted the most systematic effort to suppress Christianity that the empire had yet attempted. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, Christians who refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods were imprisoned, tortured, and in significant numbers executed. The Christian tradition remembers this as the Great Persecution, and the memory of the martyrs it produced would become a foundational element of Christian identity. It failed. The Church had put down too many roots, had too many adherents across too many levels of society, was too deeply integrated into daily life across the empire to be eliminated by official violence. The persecution gradually wound down under Diocletian's successors and was formally ended by the Edict of Toleration in 311 CE. What followed transformed not just the Church, but the empire. One of the 4 rulers of the crumbling tetrarchy was a young man named Constantine, the son of the former Caesar of the West, who had made himself master of Britain and Gaul following his father's death in 306 CE. He was ambitious, capable, and evidently a very good general. In 312 CE, he marched on Rome to defeat his rival Maxentius. The night before the decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber, Constantine reportedly experienced a vision or a dream. In different versions of the story, he saw either a cross of light in the sky or the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first letters of the name Christ in Greek, with the message in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, When the bridge of boats he had built collapsed under the press of his fleeing army, Constantine's subsequent relationship with Christianity is one of the most studied and debated questions in late antique history. Whether he was a genuine convert or a calculating politician who recognized Christianity's organizational power and mobilized it for his own purposes is a question that historians still argue about, and the most honest answer is probably that these categories were not as distinct in Constantine's own mind as we might imagine them to be. He was a Roman emperor who believed that divine favour was essential for political success, and who drew the conclusion from Milvian Bridge that the Christian God was the one providing that favour. In 313 CE, Constantine and his eastern co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which granted full legal tolerance to Christianity and all other religions, and ordered the return of property confiscated during the persecution. In 325 CE, Constantine presided over the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, which settled a major theological dispute about the nature of Christ's relationship to God, and produced the Nicene Creed that is still recited in Christian services today. The emperor was now in the business of managing Christian doctrine, a relationship between imperial and religious authority that would define the politics of Europe for the next 1,000 years. Constantine also did something with enormous long-term significance. He founded a new capital. Constantinople, built on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus Strait between Europe and Asia, was officially dedicated in 330 CE. It was designed from the beginning to be an imperial capital, equipped with its own senate, its own circus, its own forums and monuments, and eventually its own churches, including the great Hagia Sophia. The strategic logic was impeccable. The new capital sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, close to the threatened Danube and Euphrates frontiers, connected by sea to both the western and eastern Mediterranean. What it meant symbolically was equally significant. Rome was no longer the centre of the Roman world. The ancient city on the 7 hills would continue to be revered, but the actual business of running the empire would increasingly be conducted from the new city in the east, and the east and west of the empire, which had been drifting apart administratively for decades, would continue to drift in ways that would eventually result in 2 quite separate civilizations. The church rises as the empire wavers. To understand the late Roman Empire, you have to understand that religion was not a separate category from politics, culture, economics, or social life. It was woven through all of them so thoroughly that separating them is like trying to separate the threads of a cloth without destroying it. When Christianity went from being a persecuted minority faith to the religion of the emperors in the space of a single human lifetime, it did not just change Roman religion, it changed Rome and everything. The Christian Church in the early 4th century was already a complex and well-organized institution. 3 centuries of intermittent persecution, far from destroying it, had given it coherent leadership structures, a network of bishops who organized local congregations, a set of shared texts and practices, and a theology that had been sharpened by endless internal and external debate. The Church could coordinate across large distances, raise funds, distribute charity, provide social services, and most importantly provide community and meaning in ways that the traditional Roman religious institutions, with their transactional and public ritual focus, did not. When Constantine's patronage began, the Church received land grants, tax exemptions, and legal status that gave it resources it had never previously possessed. Bishops became important civic figures whose opinions the emperor consulted. New churches were built on a monumental scale, often over the sites of pagan temples or martyrs' tombs. The physical landscape of Roman cities began to change, the older temples becoming increasingly neglected while the new basilicas, the great colonnaded church buildings that adapted the Roman public hall into a worship space, rose beside them. The relationship between the Bishop of Rome and the other bishops became increasingly significant. The Roman bishops claimed to a special authority based on the tradition of Peter and Paul's martyrdom in Rome, and on Rome's historical prestige as the empire's original capital, was contested by the bishops of other major cities, particularly after Constantinople was established with its own bishop, who inevitably had better access to the emperor. These disputes about ecclesiastical authority were not merely ecclesiastical in their consequences. They affected who controlled enormous institutional resources and who had the ear of the most powerful figures in the empire. The theological disputes that erupted in this period were violent, divisive, and very difficult to explain quickly without either oversimplifying them or losing the audience in technical terminology. The Arian controversy, about whether Christ was of the same substance as God, or a similar but subordinate substance, is the most important, because it divided not just the church, but the empire. Constantine convened Nicaea in 325 CE to settle it. It did not settle it. The controversy continued for another half-century, with emperors variously supporting and opposing Arianism, councils issuing contradictory decisions, and bishops being exiled and reinstated with bewildering frequency. The Eastern Germanic peoples who were in the process of entering the empire as both soldiers and settlers in this period largely converted to Christianity in its Arian form, which meant that when they later occupied Western Roman territory, there was a religious as well as an ethnic difference between the Germanic rulers and the Roman population they ruled. The great Augustine of Hippo, bishop of the North African city of Hippo Regius from 395 to 430 CE, is the most important theological figure of the late Empire, and arguably the most influential Christian thinker before Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. His long life coincided almost exactly with the period of the Empire's final decline in the West, and his response to that decline shaped the way Christians understood the relationship between the Church and political power for centuries. When the news of Rome's sack in 410 CE reached North Africa, the shock across the Roman world was total. Pagans said it was punishment for abandoning the traditional gods. Christians had to explain why God had allowed the eternal city to fall. Augustine's answer, developed at enormous length in the City of God, was that the city that truly mattered was not Rome, but the heavenly Jerusalem, and that the Church was a pilgrim community passing through earthly politics that were ultimately transient. Empires rise and fall. The Church endures. This was, from a spiritual perspective, genuinely profound. As a political theory, it had the effect of detaching Christian loyalty from any particular political entity, which is one reason the Church survived the fall of the Western Empire and the fall of every subsequent political entity within its sphere of influence. The Church outlasted the empires because it had explained in advance why outlasting them was not a contradiction. The barbarians at the gate, who they actually were. Let us pause here and address a significant piece of historiographical received wisdom that has been slowly corroding under the attention of better scholarship for several decades. The people who are universally called barbarians in the traditional narrative of Rome's fall were not, in most cases, the howling hordes of destruction that the word implies. They were something considerably more complicated, more human, and in ways more interesting. The Latin word barbary, from which we get barbarian, was itself borrowed from the Greek barbaros, which meant simply non-Greek, and carried the same implications of outsiderness and cultural inferiority that the English word has. The Romans used it for anyone who was not Roman, but they used it selectively and inconsistently, and their relationship with the peoples they called barbarians was far more intimate, interdependent, and complicated than the standard narrative suggests. The Goths, who would play such a central role in Rome's final Western centuries, were a Germanic people who had migrated from Scandinavia into the region north of the Black Sea over the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. By the 4th century they had split into two major groupings, the Visigoths in the west and Ostrogoths in the east. They were settled farmers and herders, not nomadic raiders. They had developed their own legal traditions. They had converted to Christianity, specifically Arian Christianity, through the missionary work of a bishop named Ulfilas in the 4th century. Ulfilas had also created an alphabet for the Gothic language in order to translate the Bible. The Goths had a written language and scripture before they entered the Western Empire in any significant numbers. The Franks were another Germanic people who had been in contact with Rome since the 3rd century, providing soldiers to the Roman army in large numbers. By the 4th century, Frankish generals served at the highest levels of the Roman military. Frankish soldiers in Roman service were not fighting for a foreign power. They were, in the legal sense that mattered to Rome, fighting as Romans. Many of them held Roman citizenship, had Roman names alongside their Frankish ones, and had children who attended Roman schools and aspired to Roman careers. The Vandals, whose name has contributed a word to modern English specifically meaning destructive or brutal behaviour, were another Germanic group who had a complex relationship with Rome, involving both conflict and service as soldiers. Their sack of Rome in 455 CE, which generated the word that bears their name, was by most historical accounts considerably less destructive than the word implies. King Gaiseric apparently issued orders that churches were not to be burned and that the population was not to be massacred, distinguishing his sack from the worst-case scenario. That we still use vandal as a byword for wanton destruction says more about the power of Roman propaganda than about what the Vandals actually did. The Huns were genuinely different and genuinely terrifying. They were a Central Asian nomadic people who arrived in Eastern Europe in the 370s CE, pushing the Gothic peoples west with a violence that was not metaphorical. The Huns were exceptional horse archers who fought in a style entirely foreign to the Roman military tradition and to the Germanic peoples who had to face them first. Their sudden appearance west of the Volga disrupted the entire political geography of Eastern Europe, setting in motion a chain reaction of population movement that would redefine the political map of the Western Empire over the following century. The relationship between Rome and these peoples was never simply one of civilized Romans versus barbarian others. It was a complex web of trade, diplomacy, military service, cultural exchange, intermarriage, and yes, sometimes violent conflict. Barbarian generals commanded Roman armies. Roman diplomats lived for years at barbarian courts. Barbarian soldiers made up an increasing proportion of the Roman military from the 3rd century onward. Roman merchants traded with Gothic and Frankish communities across the frontier. The boundary between inside and outside the empire was not, in practice, the sharp line that the walls and watchtowers suggested. Understanding this does not make the fall of the Western Empire any less dramatic or any less consequential. It does make it considerably more interesting. The sack of Rome, 410 CE, and the shock that never healed. The story of how a Visigothic king named Alaric came to sack Rome in 410 CE is a story less about invasion and more about institutional failure, broken promises, and the long, slow unravelling of the relationship between the Roman state and the Germanic peoples who both served it and threatened it. Alaric was not a savage from outside Roman civilization. He'd served in the Roman army, probably held a rank of officer, and had extensive experience of Roman military organisation and culture. What he wanted after years of military service to Rome was something the Romans gave to successful military commanders as a matter of course: a permanent command, a recognised official position within the Roman military hierarchy, with a title, a salary, and the authority it implied. What Rome kept giving him instead was temporary assignments, campaign-specific appointments, and a consistent message that despite his military abilities and his contributions to Roman defence, he was not quite the right sort for permanent integration into the system. This is an oversimplification, but not an unfair one. The late Roman Empire had a structural problem with the integration of its Germanic military personnel that it never quite resolved. Germanic soldiers and commanders were essential to imperial defence. The empire could not function without them by the 4th and 5th centuries. But the Roman aristocratic and administrative class never fully accepted them as belonging, never quite extended the full trust and authority that their contributions warranted, always maintained a distinction between the Roman-born and the barbarian-born that prevented complete integration. Alaric spent years demanding what he considered his due. He received various appointments and then had them revoked. He was promised land for his people, and then the promise was withdrawn. He entered into negotiations with the Western imperial government, then with the Eastern, then back with the West. The man he dealt with most significantly on the Roman side was Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who was the effective military power behind the Western Emperor Honorius, and who tried repeatedly to reach a permanent settlement with Alaric, and was prevented from doing so by political enemies in Ravenna, the city to which the Western court had moved for safety in 402 CE. In 408 CE, Stilicho was executed on charges of treason following a political coup against him. His army mutinied, his barbarian soldiers and their families were massacred by Roman forces across Italy, and whatever chance remained of a negotiated settlement with Alaric evaporated. Alaric marched on Rome. He besieged the city in 408 CE, withdrew when a ransom was paid, besieged it again in 409 CE, made and then abandoned a deal with the emperor involving a puppet emperor, and finally, on the 24th of August, 410 CE, entered Rome through the Salarian Gate. Either the gate was opened by slaves within the city or it was betrayed by sympathizers. The Visigoths were inside the walls of Rome. What followed was 3 days of looting. Churches, particularly the shrines of Peter and Paul, were apparently protected by Alaric's orders and served as places of refuge. The population was not systematically massacred, though there was certainly violence and there were certainly individual atrocities. The wealthiest households, many of their inhabitants already fled or in hiding, were stripped of their portable wealth. Hundreds of years of accumulated treasure from the greatest city in the Mediterranean world was carried off by Alaric's army, and then they left. Alaric marched south through Italy, apparently intending to cross to North Africa, but died of illness in the toe of the Italian boot before he could accomplish this. His people buried him in the bed of a river, then returned the river to its course so his grave could not be found. They took the slaves who had dug the grave to silence. Alaric was 34 years old. The sack lasted 3 days. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was not particularly severe. Cities taken by storm in this period typically suffered far worse. But Rome had not been taken by an enemy since the Gauls in 390 BCE, 800 years earlier. The physical damage was significant but temporary. The psychological damage was epical. Jerome, the great biblical scholar who was living in Bethlehem at the time, wrote that when the news reached him, his voice stuck in his throat. Ambrose of Milan said that Rome had fallen who was born never to fall. Across the Roman world, educated people who had ordered their understanding of history and civilization around the assumption of Rome's permanence found the bottom dropping out of their conceptual universe. If Rome could fall, what could not fall? The answer, of course, was nothing. Augustine's Great City of God was a response to that question, an attempt to rebuild the conceptual foundation of Christian civilization on something more durable than any earthly empire. It remains one of the most read and studied works of political theology in Western history. Rome would be sacked again, less dramatically, but with more lasting political consequence, in 455 CE by the Vandals. But it was 410 CE that people remembered. It was 410 CE that changed the way educated people thought about time, civilization, and the relationship between human achievement and divine favor. The Western Empire collapses. A death in slow motion. The decades between 410 and 476 CE are sometimes described as if the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a dramatic event, a crash rather than a slow dissolution. The reality was considerably messier and, in some ways, more interesting. The Western Empire did not suddenly collapse. It gradually became less and less capable of doing the things that had made it the Western Empire, until the moment in 476 CE, when a barbarian king deposed the last emperor, was not so much a climax as a formality. The Western Empire in the years after 410 was a thing still going through the motions of being an empire while the substance drained away. The Western court sat at Ravenna, a city chosen for its defensibility because it sat in the middle of marshes that made it nearly impossible to attack. This was practical but symbolically disastrous. The government of the Roman Empire was hiding in a marsh. The emperors of the West in this period were largely children or figureheads, controlled by powerful military commanders, many of them of Germanic origin, who held the real power under the title of Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers. This was not necessarily a sign of barbarian takeover, so much as a continuation of a pattern that had been building for decades, in which the actual business of governing and defending the empire was conducted by professionals, while the emperors provided dynastic legitimacy. The most important of these military commanders was Flavius Aetius, who dominated Western imperial politics for roughly 2 decades in the 430 and 440s CE, and who history has called the last of the Romans, a title that is probably too romantic but contains something real. Aetius was a Roman of traditional aristocratic background, who had spent time as a hostage among both the Huns and the Visigoths as a young man, learning their languages and cultures and building personal relationships with their leaders. He used this unique position to navigate the extraordinarily complex politics of the era, playing various barbarian groups off against each other and maintaining a semblance of Western imperial power through diplomatic skill as much as through military force. His greatest achievement was the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in June 451 CE, sometimes called the Battle of the Mâconnais or the Battle of Chalons, fought somewhere in northern France against the Huns under their king Attila. By this point, the Huns under Attila had become the dominant military force in the known world, a confederation of peoples from Central Asia who had swept into Eastern Europe and were now conducting campaigns of extraordinary destructive power into both the Eastern and Western empires. Attila was by any measure a remarkable figure. Contemporary sources describe a short, broad man with a large head and thin beard and small, deep-set eyes, who moved with an air of authority so absolute that people who met him could barely speak. He negotiated with empires as an equal, or something more than an equal, and his court attracted ambassadors, adventurers, and sycophants from across the known world. The diplomat Priscus, who visited his court in 449 CE, left an account that is one of the most vivid pieces of ethnographic writing from late antiquity, describing Attila eating from a wooden bowl while his courtiers ate from silver plate, maintaining a simplicity of personal style that was itself a form of demonstration of contempt for the luxuries his wealth could have provided. At the Catalonian plains, Aetius assembled a coalition of Romans and Visigoths, and various other allied peoples to oppose Attila's invasion of Gaul. The battle was one of the largest and most violent of the late antique period. Attila was stopped. His army, though not destroyed, retreated. The following year he invaded Italy, sacking cities in the north before turning away without attacking Rome itself. The reason he turned away without attacking Rome has been debated. Disease in his army, the difficulty of supplying it in the Italian peninsula, the persuasion of Pope Leo I, who famously met with Attila in person, possibly all three. Attila died in 453 CE, reportedly of a nosebleed on his wedding night, which was either a genuinely undignified end for the most feared man in the world, or a story that reflects how his enemies wanted to remember him. Without Attila, the Hun Confederation dissolved almost immediately. The subject peoples who had been held in it by his force of personality broke away. The Huns, as a major political and military factor, disappeared from history with remarkable speed. Aetius did not long survive his greatest victory. In 454 CE he was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in a private audience, struck down apparently by the emperor's own hand in a fit of paranoid rage. The following year, Valentinian himself was killed by two of Aetius's former bodyguards. Within a matter of months, the two men who had sustained the Western Empire at its most effective level were both dead. The Vandals, under their capable king Gaiseric, who had crossed from Spain to North Africa in 429 CE and established a Vandal kingdom there that had been formally recognized by the Western Empire, sacked Rome in 455 CE. This sack was more leisurely than Alaric's, lasting 2 weeks, and Gaiseric made off with enormous quantities of treasure, including, reportedly, the treasures of Jerusalem that Titus had brought to Rome after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The Vandals also took numerous Roman aristocrats as hostages and captives, including the former Empress Eudoxia and her daughters. After 455 CE, the Western emperors came and went with such frequency that listing them is an exercise in numerology rather than history. 9 emperors in 21 years, most of them either appointed by barbarian military commanders or murdered by them. The Western Empire was not being invaded. It was being administered out of existence. 476. The last emperor and the end of an era, his name was Romulus Augustulus, which is almost too perfect to be true and yet is entirely true. Romulus after the mythic founder of Rome, Augustus after the greatest of its emperors, Augulus, the diminutive, the little, because he was a boy and because history has a sense of humour that tends toward the sardonic. He was 14 years old when he became the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, and one strongly suspects had absolutely no idea what was happening or why. His father Orestes had been a Roman general of considerable ability, who had the particular distinction of having once served as Attila the Hun's secretary, which tells you something about how thoroughly the late Roman world had blurred its categories. Orestes in 475 CE deposed the previous Western emperor, a man named Nepos, who had the slight advantage of being somewhat legitimate, and placed his own teenage son on the throne. Julius Nepos, the deposed emperor, did not particularly accept this, and continued to call himself the legitimate Western emperor from his court in Dalmatia, which is a minor complication in the clean narrative of 476 CE, but which the traditional story usually ignores. The military commander who actually held power in Italy in 476 was a man named Odoacer, the leader of a confederation of Germanic soldiers who were serving in the Roman army in Italy. These soldiers, a mixture of Herulians, Rugians, and Siri, wanted something that the Roman government had been promising and not delivering: land grants in Italy, the retirement benefit that Roman soldiers had been promised for generations. Orestes refused. The soldiers rebelled. Orestes was captured and killed. Odoacer then made a decision that was in some ways the most consequential political act of the 5th century, and in other ways barely noticed at the time. He decided not to appoint a new Western emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the ornaments of office, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, along with a message suggesting that one emperor was sufficient, and that Odoacer was quite happy to govern Italy as the Eastern Emperor's representative. Zeno, who had his own political complications and was not particularly enthusiastic about the implications of this proposal, but was also not in a position to do much about it, essentially accepted. Romulus Augustulus was allowed to retire to a comfortable villa in Campania and live out his days in comfortable obscurity. He may have lived as late as 508 or 509 CE, a man who had been the last Roman emperor in the West, and then spent the remainder of his life growing old in a castle that his parents had ironically named the Castellum Lucullanum, after the great gourmet Lucullus. Whether anyone pointed out the irony is unrecorded. The significance of 476 CE as a date is partly retrospective. Contemporary observers did not necessarily experience it as the end of anything in particular. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople continued. It would continue for another 977 years. The administrative machinery of the western regions continued to function under Odoacer, and then under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who replaced him in 493 CE. Roman law continued to be the legal framework for the new kingdoms. Roman landowners continued to own their land. Roman bishops continued to administer their dioceses. Latin continued to be the language of the church, the law, and the educated class. What ended in 476 was not Roman civilization. What ended was the Western Roman Empire as a political entity with its own emperor. The distinction matters, even if it does not reduce the drama of the moment. Gibbon famously began his reckoning of the fall of Rome from the reign of Commodus in 180 CE, suggesting that the process took 300 years. Other historians begin the story of decline in the 3rd century crisis. Others argue that what happened in the 5th century was less a fall than a transformation. The historian Peter Heather in 206 CE wrote that the fall of the Western Roman Empire was the biggest political catastrophe in the history of the Western world. Brian Ward Perkins in 205 CE argued for the material reality of decline, pointing to archaeological evidence of genuine economic and cultural deterioration. Guy Halsall and Walter Goffert have argued that the transformation was more gradual and less catastrophic than the traditional narrative implies. They are all, in different ways, correct. History is rarely tidy enough to have single causes, single moments, single meanings. What we can say is this. When Romulus Augustulus handed over his regalia in 476 CE, the thing that had once stood astride the world from Scotland to Mesopotamia, that had kept the peace for 2 centuries across 50 million people, that had built the Colosseum and the Pantheon, and the aqueducts and the roads, that had produced Virgil and Ovid and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and Augustine, that had been the dominant organizing force of Western European civilization for 500 years, was gone as a unified political reality. What replaced it was something different, several things different, and the process of working out what those things were would take the next several centuries. The Eastern Empire lives on. Byzantium. Here is the thing that the phrase fall of Rome tends to obscure. The Roman Empire did not fall in 476 CE. Half of it did. The eastern half centered on Constantinople, the city Constantine had founded on the Bosphorus, continued to call itself the Roman Empire, continued to use Roman law, continued to speak Greek, which had always been the dominant language of the eastern provinces, and continued to insist on its continuity with Augustus and the Principate for nearly another 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire, which we call Byzantium after the name of the Greek city that preceded Constantinople, fell in 1453 CE when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VII took Constantinople. That is not a typo. 1453. The Roman Empire in its eastern form survived until the middle of the 15th century. Joan of Arc lived and died almost 20 years before the final end of the Roman Empire. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople happened 14 years after Gutenberg began working on his printing press. The Byzantines did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi, and they meant it. Their emperor was the heir of Augustus. Their legal system was Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the massive 6th century compilation of Roman law that remains the foundation of legal systems across much of the world today. Their liturgy was conducted in Greek, but their cultural and political identity was explicitly Roman. When Western European crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204 CE, the Byzantines regarded it as an attack on Rome by barbarians. They were not wrong. The most remarkable figure of early Byzantine history was Justinian thus, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE. Justinian was a man of provincial origin from the Balkans, who had been educated in Constantinople, and who thought on a truly imperial scale. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533 to 534 CE, then reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths in a long and devastating war that lasted from 535 to 554 CE. For a few decades, the Mediterranean was once again, at least nominally, a Roman lake. The cost was enormous. The reconquest of Italy devastated a peninsula already weakened by decades of Ostrogothic rule and Gothic war, and the Italy that emerged from Justinian's reconquest was poorer, less populated and less urbanized than the Italy that had existed before the Western Empire's collapse. The attempt to restore Roman unity created conditions in the West that made genuine recovery harder, not easier. Justinian's other great achievement was the codification of Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under the direction of his legal scholar Tribonian, organized centuries of accumulated Roman legal texts, decisions, and principles into a systematic framework that could be taught, studied, and applied consistently. This code became the foundation of legal practice across the Byzantine Empire and, after its rediscovery in the 12th century CE, of legal systems across Western Europe. It is not an exaggeration to say that a significant portion of the legal framework that governs much of the modern world derives ultimately from Justinian's 6th century compilation of Roman law. He also built the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople, completed in 537 CE, which remained the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years, and which is widely considered the greatest surviving achievement of Byzantine architecture. When Justinian first saw the completed building, he is reported to have said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," referring to the legendary temple in Jerusalem. The building's central dome, appearing to float above the space below through a ring of windows at its base, is one of the most extraordinary architectural experiences in the world, as a mosque from 1453 CE and as a museum, and now once again as a mosque in the 21st century it still stands in Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire after Justinian contracted again as the military pressure of Sassanid Persia in the east and of Slavic and Avar peoples in the Balkans made the reconquered Western territories increasingly expensive to defend. By the 7th century CE, the Arab conquests following the death of Muhammad in 632 CE had taken Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa from Byzantine control. The empire shrank to Anatolia and the Balkans, which was still a very significant territory, but a long way from the Mediterranean-spanning ambitions of Justinian. It continued to function, to fight, to produce art and theology and literature and legal scholarship through the medieval period, through the Crusades, through encounters with the Seljuk Turks who defeated it decisively at Manzikert in 1071 CE. It absorbed shocks that would have destroyed lesser polities and kept functioning, diminished, through the 13th and 14th centuries. The end came on May 29, 1453 CE, when Ottoman cannon breached the great walls of Constantinople that had protected the city for 1,000 years, and the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, died in the fighting on the walls, his body never definitively identified. The Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque that afternoon. The Roman Empire was truly over. Why did Rome fall? The question that never gets old. Edward Gibbon published the first volume of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, which is a date that should ring a bell for entirely different reasons. His argument, developed across 6 volumes and roughly 3,000 pages written in prose of extraordinary elegance, was essentially that Rome fell because of the rise of Christianity and the incursions of the barbarians, with Christianity being the more fundamental cause. Christianity, Gibbon argued, redirected the energies of talented Romans from civic and military service towards spiritual concerns, undermined the martial virtues that had made Rome great, and filled the empire with monks and priests who were parasitic on the productive economy. Gibbon was a man of the Enlightenment writing in the tradition of skeptical rationalism, and his argument reflects those values more than it reflects the historical evidence. Most historians of the late empire today do not find his thesis convincing as a primary explanation, though it remains readable and contains genuine insight alongside its biases. The question of why Rome fell has generated something in the vicinity of 210 proposed explanations since Gibbon, which says something either about the importance of the question or about the tendency of historians to compete with each other. These explanations range from the plausible to the eccentric to the genuinely bizarre. Military overextension is one of the most consistently cited factors and has real force. The Roman Empire's borders were simply very long relative to its economic base. Defending the Rhine, Danube, Euphrates and Saharan frontiers simultaneously required an enormous army that was an enormous expense. When the economy was strong and the political system was stable, this expense was manageable. When either the economy or the political system faltered, the military began to suffer, The frontiers became more permeable, and the increased threat required increased expenditure at the exact moment when revenues were declining. Political instability compounds the military problem. An empire that had 50 different emperors in 50 years, most of them killed by rivals, cannot sustain the consistent long-term strategic planning that frontier defense requires. Every coup or succession crisis diverted military resources from the frontier to internal conflict. Every proscription that eliminated experienced administrators or generals represented an irreplaceable loss of institutional competence. Economic decline is harder to assess because the economic data for the Roman Empire is fragmentary and contested, but the archaeological evidence of the 5th century shows clear signs of declining activity. Urban populations contracted, long-distance trade diminished, coin finds suggest less commercial activity. The evidence of lead in ice cores from Greenland, which records atmospheric pollution from Roman-era metal smelting, shows a dramatic decline from the 3rd century onward that only recovers with the Industrial Revolution. Something real happened to the Roman economy, even if its precise dimensions are debated. Climate and disease have received more attention from historians in recent decades, partly because better scientific methods have made it possible to identify what previous generations could not. The 5th and 6th centuries saw a period of climate cooling that affected agricultural productivity across the northern Mediterranean world. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, both of which appear to have been early forms of smallpox or measles introduced to a population with no immunity, killed significant percentages of the empire's population and disrupted economic and military capacity in ways that have only recently been appreciated. The Justinianic Plague of the 6th century, which appears to have been bubonic plague, the same disease that would devastate Europe in the 14th century, struck the Byzantine Empire in its period of maximum Justinianic ambition, and may have made the reconquest of the West permanently unsustainable. The lead pipes theory, which held for several decades that Roman aristocrats were slowly poisoned by the lead in their water pipes and wine vessels, resulting in intellectual decline and reduced fertility among the ruling class, has largely been abandoned by specialists. The Romans did use lead extensively in their plumbing and cooking equipment, and chronic lead exposure would certainly have had negative health effects. But the degree to which this could explain the fall of an empire is almost certainly far too small to matter at the macro level. The most honest answer to why Rome fell is probably that it fell because of many factors that reinforced each other in unfortunate ways. A strong empire can absorb military pressure, or political instability, or economic decline, or pandemic disease, or climate stress. The Roman Empire in the 5th century faced all of these simultaneously, each one reducing the capacity to resist the others, in a cascade of compounding failures that proved impossible to reverse. What this means for us, looking back from the 21st century, is that the fall of Rome was not inevitable. At multiple points in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, different decisions, better luck, slightly different political structures might have produced different outcomes. History is not a machine that produces inevitable results. It is the accumulated consequence of decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, and understanding those circumstances is the only way to understand why things turned out as they did. What Rome left behind? The legacy that surrounds us. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476 CE. Roman civilization did not. What replaced Rome was not a blank space on the map of human history, but a transformation, a long and slow alchemical process by which Roman forms, ideas and institutions were absorbed into new contexts and became something different while remaining, in their foundations, recognizably Roman. You cannot remove Rome from Western civilization without removing the civilization itself. The two are too thoroughly fused to separate. The Latin language is perhaps the most pervasive proof of this. Latin did not die when the Western Empire fell. It transformed, differently in different regions, into the Romance languages. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian and Romanian are not merely influenced by Latin. They are Latin, modified over 15 centuries by the populations who spoke them, the neighbouring languages they absorbed, and the gradual isolation of different regions as centralised Roman communication broke down. When a Spaniard and a Romanian discover that their languages share vocabulary and grammar, despite 1,000 miles of separation, they are discovering their shared Roman inheritance. The Roman soldier who garrisoned a provincial town in the 3rd century CE is still speaking in some sense through every one of them. Latin itself survived the empire's fall as the language of the church, and through the Church as the language of European scholarship, law, and administration for over 1,000 years afterward. Medieval scholars corresponded across national boundaries in Latin. Legal documents were drafted in Latin. Scientific works were composed in Latin. When Newton published the Principia Mathematica in 1687 CE, he wrote it in Latin. The inscriptions you see today on government buildings, university mottos, legal documents, banknotes, and scientific nomenclature are a direct and unbroken line back to Rome. Roman law is equally present and equally invisible to those who have never looked for it. The legal codes of most of continental Europe derive from Roman law as codified by Justinian in the 6th century, and rediscovered in European universities from the 11th century onward. The presumption of innocence, the distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personhood, the idea that contracts are binding and that obligations can be defined in writing, property rights, civil versus criminal procedure. All of this is Roman. The legal universe most of the modern world inhabits is Roman in ways that go far deeper than any law school curriculum typically acknowledges. Roman engineering left physical legacies still standing, and in some cases still functional 2,000 years after their construction. The Pantheon in Rome, the Pont-du-Gard aqueduct in southern France, the amphitheatres at Nîmes and Verona, sections of Roman road that still underlie modern highways across Europe. These are not curiosities or museum pieces. They are evidence of a practical engineering tradition of extraordinary competence and durability. The architectural vocabulary of Western building, the column, the arch, the dome, the basilica plan, all flows from Roman practice as transmitted through the Renaissance to every subsequent tradition of Western architecture. When a 19th century bank in a Midwestern American city was built to look like a Roman temple, its architect was making a claim about permanence and legitimacy that connected directly back to Rome's own use of monumental architecture as political communication. The Catholic Church is in many respects the most direct institutional heir of the Roman Empire, which is a fact that may disconcert either the Church or Rome's admirers, depending on which group they belong to. The Church inherited the Latin language, the Roman administrative geography of diocese modelled on provincial boundaries, the legal traditions of Roman civic organisation, and the deeply Roman habit of thinking of itself as the universal institution encompassing all humanity. The Pope's title, Pontifex Maximus, was a title of the Roman high priesthood before it was adopted by the bishops of Rome. The hierarchy of Pope, cardinals, bishops, and priests mirrors in spiritualized form the Roman hierarchy of emperor, prefects, governors, and local officials. The political inheritance is more ambiguous but no less pervasive. Every European monarch from Charlemagne onward legitimized power partly by claiming continuity with Rome. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in 800 CE, was an explicit attempt to revive Western Roman political unity, and survived in increasingly attenuated form until Napoleon abolished it in 1806 CE. Napoleon then crowned himself emperor in conscious Roman imitation. The American founders studied Rome intensively, worried aloud about whether their republic would eventually produce a Caesar, and named their nation's deliberative body after the Roman Senate. The word republic itself comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing. That anxiety about republican fragility and the tendency of military power to subvert civilian governance is Roman in origin and has not dated at all. The calendar is Roman. July is Julius Caesar. August is Augustus. The months of our year, the structure of our days, our inherited sense of how time is organized, all derive from Julius Caesar's calendar reform of 45 BCE, revised slightly by Pope Gregory III in 1582 CE, and otherwise essentially unchanged. The names we give our children are very often Roman: Marcus, Julia, Claudia, Adrian, Camilla, Victor, Maximus. The archetypes that populate our stories, the emperor, the gladiator, the senator, the general who becomes a tyrant, have been recycled through Western culture since Rome itself produced them. What strikes me most at the end of all this is not Rome's grandeur but its ordinariness and its fragility. The legionary who died at the Trebia River, the slave carrying water up apartment stairs each morning, the boy emperor handing over his crown and going to grow old in a seaside villa. These were people, not symbols. They had no idea what chapter of history they were living in. They only knew what they could see that day. Neither do we. We too are somewhere inside a story whose meaning will only be clear to people looking back at us from a distance we cannot imagine. The Romans did not know they were Rome. They were simply trying to build something, hold something together, believe in something worth believing in, And what they built was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. Flawed and brutal and magnificent all at once. The Colosseum stands, the Pantheon stands, the Latin language stands in 100 million mouths that have never once thought about Rome. The empire is gone. The idea of it never quite left. Sleep now. The 7 hills have been quiet for a long time, and the Forum can wait until morning.